Hey guys, tonight we begin slowly and gently with a story that stretches across cold palaces, long corridors, and lives shaped more by duty than desire. So let your thoughts loosen a little, let the noise fade, and settle into a calm drift as history unfolds the way it usually does. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, patiently, as if it knows it has all the time in the world. We start with a girl who was not meant to matter very much at all. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a small German princess from a family that carried noble titles without the power to back them up. This was not the kind of background that promised greatness. It promised usefulness, marriage, and quiet obedience. Sophie grew up aware of her limitations, and that awareness sharpened her. She read constantly, absorbing ideas, watching people carefully, and learning how to listen more than she spoke, which would later become one of her most effective habits. When Sophie arrived in Russia as a teenager, she stepped into a world that was both glittering and brutal. The Russian court was formal, ceremonial, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. But Sophie did what survivors always do. She adapted. She learned the language. She converted to orthodoxy. She reshaped herself until she fit the role expected of her, and she did it without complaint. Outwardly, she became Catherine. Inwardly, she observed everything. Her marriage to the future Peter III was never affectionate. Peter was childish, obsessed with military toys, and emotionally detached. He preferred drills to diplomacy and fantasy to responsibility. Catherine quickly realized that waiting for him to mature would be a waste of time. Instead, she focused on herself. She educated her mind, studied Russian politics, and built quiet alliances. She learned which courtiers mattered, which ones could be ignored, and which ones would eventually become dangerous. Peter alienated the court with his behavior and policies, while Catherine did the opposite. She presented herself as composed, interested, and capable. When the moment came, the transition of power was swift and decisive. Peter was removed, confined, and soon dead under circumstances that history politely avoids examining too closely. Catherine stepped into power without hesitation because hesitation in that environment was fatal. As Empress, Catherine ruled with a careful blend of idealism and realism. She admired Enlightenment thinkers and believed deeply in education, reform, and rational governance. She wrote extensively, corresponded with philosophers, and imagined herself as a modern ruler guiding Russia toward progress. But ideals were always filtered through practicality. She understood that her power depended on the nobility, and the nobility depended on serfdom. So while she spoke of reform, she expanded the very system that bound millions to the land. This contradiction did not trouble her as much as later generations hoped it might. She believed stability mattered more than purity. Her reign expanded Russia's borders through calculated wars and strategic annexations. She governed relentlessly, reading reports late into the night and maintaining tight control over administration. She surrounded herself with advisors who were useful rather than sentimental, and dismissed them just as easily when they ceased to be so. Her personal relationships followed a similar pattern. She took lovers, ended relationships cleanly, and rarely allowed emotion to interfere with governance. The court talked endlessly, but Catherine remained unmoved. She understood that reputation could be managed and power could not be surrendered. When she died, Russia was larger, stronger, and more centralized than it had been before. She left behind an empire that reflected her priorities and her compromises. She was not gentle. She was not sentimental. She ruled deliberately, and history remembered her as great because she endured and expanded where others hesitated. But her story, for all its documentation, still leaves questions behind. Questions about cost, about contradiction, and about the quiet weight of authority carried alone. From the cold order of Imperial Russia, we drift far south to a place where power was expressed not through documents and decrees, but through ritual, stone, and silence. Deep in the ancient city of Palenque, a sealed chamber rested undisturbed for centuries, hidden beneath layers of jungle and time. When it was finally opened, it revealed not a king, but a woman, buried in red. The tomb was filled with cinnabar, a vivid red powder made from mercury sulfide. It coated the walls, the offerings, and the body itself. The color was striking, almost alive, and deeply symbolic. In Maya belief, red represented blood, life, and rebirth. To cover the dead in it was to prepare them for transformation rather than decay. The woman inside wore a jade mask, ear ornaments, and jewelry reserved only for the elite. This was not an ordinary burial. This was someone important. She became known as the Red Queen, not because of a recorded title, but because of the visual power of her tomb. There were no inscriptions naming her, no clear explanation of her role. Her identity remained deliberately ambiguous. This absence puzzled scholars, but within Maya cosmology, it made sense. Identity was preserved through ritual placement, through symbolism, and through relationship to sacred space. She did not need to be named, she needed to be positioned. Her tomb lay close to that of Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. The proximity suggested connection. Perhaps she was his wife, perhaps his mother, perhaps a high-ranking priestess whose authority was spiritual rather than political. Maya women held significant power. They conducted rituals, acted as regents, and preserved dynastic continuity. The Red Queen's burial suggested reverence rather than subordination. She was not hidden, she was honored quietly. The architecture of her tomb mirrored a spiritual journey. The descent echoed the path to the underworld. The alignment followed cosmic patterns. The space was intentionally restrained, drawing attention inward rather than outward. She was not meant to be remembered through spectacle, but through endurance. And she endured, silent and undisturbed, until her presence resurfaced centuries later, still commanding attention without explanation. Power takes many forms. Sometimes it announces itself with crowns and armies, sometimes it rests quietly beneath stone, and sometimes it survives through expression, born from pain rather than privilege. In the vibrant world of early 20th century Mexico, a child named Frida Kahlo ended life already marked by struggle. Her early years were shaped by illness, by isolation, and by a vivid inner world that refused to stay contained. Polio left her physically altered and socially withdrawn. She spent long periods alone, reading and observing. Her mind became her refuge. When a catastrophic bus accident shattered her body years later, it also altered her future permanently. She endured surgeries, immobility, and chronic pain that followed her for the rest of her life. But within that stillness, she found a voice. Painting became necessity rather than ambition. Self-portrait became language. Frida painted herself repeatedly, not out of vanity, but because she was the subject she knew most intimately. Her work did not soften suffering. It presented it directly. Broken bodies, exposed organs, unflinching gazes filled her canvases. She fused personal pain with cultural symbolism, combining indigenous imagery, political conviction, and emotional honesty. Her relationship with Diego Rivera was intense, volatile, and creatively intertwined. They loved each other fiercely, betrayed each other frequently, and remained bound through shared ideology and expression. Her politics were inseparable from her art. She rejected passivity, embraced identity, and painted through exhaustion and decline. Her body weakened over time, but her presence strengthened. She dressed deliberately, presented herself boldly, and refused to minimize her experience. When recognition finally arrived, it did not transform her, it amplified what was already there. She became a symbol not by seeking it, but by existing openly and truthfully within her. Contradiction. Across centuries and cultures, these women navigated power, identity, and survival within systems that limited their choices. They adapted, they endured, they reshaped their worlds quietly, persistently. History often remembers outcomes more than processes, but beneath every reign, ritual, and canvas lies a life shaped by constraint and determination. The slow current of time carries these stories forward, layered and patient, allowing patterns to emerge gently beneath the surface as the narrative continues uninterrupted. Frida's life did not resolve neatly, and it was never meant to. Her pain did not fade into symbolism and disappear. It stayed physical, persistent, and exhausting. She lived with constant discomfort, with days shaped by what her body would allow rather than what her mind wanted. She underwent surgery after surgery, each one promising relief and delivering only partial mercy. And still, she painted. She painted from her bed. She painted while immobilized. She painted using mirrors hung above her face, because movement was not always possible, but observation was. She became intimately familiar with herself, with every expression, every angle, every scar. That familiarity became her archive. Her home became both sanctuary and stage. The Blue House was filled with color, objects, animals, and people drifting in and out. Friends, artists, political thinkers, exiles, and admirers gathered. They're drawn not just to Frida's work, but to her presence. She was magnetic without effort. She spoke plainly. She dressed deliberately. She did not hide her pain, but she did not ask for sympathy either. She treated suffering as a fact, not a performance, and that honesty unsettled people more than drama ever could. Her marriage to Diego Rivera continued its slow cycle of separation and reunion. They divorced, they remarried, they argued endlessly. They shared political beliefs and artistic respect, but struggled with intimacy, trust. Diego's infidelities wounded her deeply, not because she expected perfection, but because betrayal landed harder when one already felt physically broken. Frida responded not with retreat, but with expression. She painted her anger, her grief, jealousy, and her resilience, layering emotion into image without apology. As her health declined, her reputation quietly grew. Exhibitions appeared. She gained recognition beyond Mexico, particularly among those who saw something unfiltered in her work. She resisted being categorized. She was not interested in fitting neatly into movements or expectations. She painted what she lived. She lived what she painted. When critics searched for metaphor, she offered truth. When they searched for distance, she offered closeness. She became unavoidable. Near the end of her life, mobility became limited. Amputation took part of her leg. Pain intensified. Fatigue deepened. But her spirit remained sharp. When she attended her final exhibition, she arrived on a bed carried into the gallery, refusing absence. She greeted visitors. She drank. She laughed softly. She existed fully in the space she had earned. When she died, her work remained unchanged, unsoftened, and deeply human. Across continents and centuries, the thread connecting these lives is not ambition alone, but endurance. Catherine adapted to power by mastering systems. The Red Queen embodied authority through ritual and silence. Frida transformed suffering into visibility. None of them fit comfortably into the roles history preferred for them. And yet, they endured within those structures, reshaping them subtly, leaving traces that could not be erased. History often presents power as loud and decisive, but more often it is quiet and sustained. It appears in daily persistence, in adaptation, in choosing continuation over collapse. These women navigated worlds that limited them, and rather than breaking outright, they bent, redirected, and redefined influence on their own terms. Their stories do not rush. They unfold gradually, layer by layer, like sediments settling over time. The empress governed an empire that demanded certainty. The queen rested in a tomb designed for cosmic balance. The artist lived in a body that refused comfort. Each faced isolation differently, but none escaped it entirely. Power isolates, pain isolates, silence isolates. And yet, within that isolation, each found a way to assert presence. Catherine through law and expansion, the Red Queen through ritual permanence, Frida through image and honesty. Their lives remind us that history is not only shaped by conquest and decree, but by endurance through contradiction. The slow repetition of human patterns continues across eras. Authority seeks stability, identity seeks expression, suffering seeks meaning, and individuals respond as best they can within the limits they inherit. The surface details change, the structures remain familiar. As time drifts forward, the echoes of these lives remain embedded in culture, in scholarship, in art, and in memory. They are revisited not because they were flawless, but because they were complete. They lived fully within constraint. They left records that resist simplification, and they continue to speak quietly to those willing to listen slowly. The passage of time does not erase complexity. It softens edges but leaves core truths intact. Empires rise and contract. Beliefs shift. Rituals fade or transform. But the human experience beneath these changes remains consistent: the desire to matter, the effort to endure, the search for agency within systems larger than oneself. These stories do not demand attention, they simply persist, and so the narrative carries on, uninterrupted, layered with quiet repetition and subtle variation, allowing history to move at its own pace, steady and unhurried, continuing forward without pause, without conclusion, as the patterns quietly unfold and rearrange themselves again and again beneath the surface. The story keeps moving not because it wants to reach a conclusion, but because time never learned how to stop. It stretches forward calmly, carrying with it the residue of lives already lived and layering new meaning over what came before. Frida's paintings remained after her body failed her, and those images began to travel farther than she ever could. They moved through galleries, through books, through quiet conversations between people standing too long in front of a canvas, trying to understand why a single gaze could feel so heavy. Her work was not comforting, it was steady. It sat with pain rather than resolving it, and that refusal became its strength. Long after Frida was gone, people continued to speak about her as if she was still present, because her work never separated the artist from the art. She painted herself so completely that removing her from the images felt impossible. She became her own archive, documenting not just events, but sensations, fatigue, anger, resilience, defiance, the subtle humor she carried even in despair. Her legacy did not rely on perfection or polish. It relied on honesty sustained over time. And that honesty aged slowly, remaining relevant without needing reinterpretation. Catherine's legacy aged differently. It settled into institutions, territories, and policies. Her personal presence faded into portraits and anecdotes, but the system she shaped continued functioning. She became referenced rather than felt. Her letters preserved intellect. Her reforms preserved order. Her contradictions preserved debate. She existed in textbooks and discussions about power, about enlightened absolutism, about the tension between idealism and control. She was remembered as capable, strategic, and relentless, which she was. But the quieter elements of her life, the isolation, the constant vigilance, the calculated restraint, were absorbed into the broader narrative of empire, where personal cost rarely receives its own space. The Red Queen remained the most distant of the three. Her presence was never textual. It was physical and symbolic. Her bones, her tomb, her red shroud of cinnabar. She existed without commentary, without recorded voice, without explanation. And yet, her impact lingered in the questions she raised. She disrupted assumptions. She challenged narratives that minimized female authority in ancient societies. She stood as evidence that power did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it was ritualized. Sometimes it was sealed away deliberately. Sometimes it was preserved not through repetition, but through placement. What binds these stories is not geography or chronology, but pattern. The pattern of women navigating systems that offered limited flexibility, the pattern of adaptation rather than rebellion, the pattern of endurance over spectacle. Catherine did not overthrow monarchy. She mastered it. Frida did not escape pain. She translated it. The Red Queen did not leave records. She left alignment. Each responded to constraint differently, but none operated outside of it. They worked within structures that predated them, and their influence came from understanding those structures deeply enough to maneuver inside them. History often frames influence as disruption, but much of it is maintenance, the maintenance of presence, the maintenance of authority, the maintenance of self under pressure. Catherine maintained legitimacy in a court that questioned her. Frida maintained identity in a body that betrayed her. The Red Queen maintained significance in a culture that prioritized cosmic balance over individual narrative. These acts of maintenance rarely appear dramatic, but they are exhausting. They require consistency. They require restraint. They require patience stretched across years. As time moved forward, the societies surrounding these figures continued to change. Empires collapsed. New ideologies emerged. Art movements shifted. Power redistributed unevenly. But the underlying dynamics of authority, identity, and endurance remained recognizable. New names replaced old ones. New symbols replaced familiar ones. But the rhythm stayed the same. Expectation placed upon individuals by systems larger than themselves. Response shaped by available tools. Adaptation determined by circumstance. In Catherine's Russia, the emphasis on stability delayed reform but preserved cohesion. In the Maya world, the emphasis on ritual preserved continuity beyond individual lifespans. In Frida's Mexico, The emphasis on cultural identity allowed personal expression to merge with collective narrative. Each context offered different constraints and different possibilities, but none offered freedom in the absolute sense. Freedom was partial, negotiated, and fragile. The lives of elites often appear privileged from a distance, and in material terms they often were. But privilege did not remove pressure, it redirected it. Visibility increased scrutiny, expectation replaced choice, security replaced intimacy. These figures lived under constant observation, whether by court, cosmos, or audience. They learned to perform selectively, to conceal strategically, and to reveal only what served their survival or expression. Catherine crafted an image of authority. Frida crafted an image of honesty. The Red Queen's culture crafted an image of cosmic order. None of these images were accidental. They were responses to environment. They were shaped by necessity rather than preference. And over time, they solidified into legacy. Legacy is often treated as something left behind intentionally, but more often it is the residue of repeated choices made under constraint. It forms slowly, without announcement. It becomes visible only in retrospect when distance allows pattern recognition. As generations passed, interpretations layered themselves onto these lives. Catherine became a symbol of enlightened despotism, admired and critiqued in equal measure. Frida became an icon, resilience, identity, and defiance, sometimes flattened into aesthetic without full acknowledgement of suffering. The Red Queen became a focal point for discussions about gender and power in ancient civilizations, her silence filled with scholarly speculation. These interpretations said as much about the present as about the past. They reflected contemporary concerns projected backward, searching for resonance. Yet beneath interpretation, the core realities remained unchanged. Catherine ruled because she seized opportunity and maintained control. Frida created because expression was survival. The Red Queen was honored because ritual demanded balance. These truths resisted reinterpretation. They grounded the stories, preventing them from drifting entirely into abstraction. Time continued, carrying new figures into similar positions. New rulers faced inherited systems. New artists faced physical or emotional limitation. New discoveries challenged established narratives. The repetition was not exact, but it was familiar. History does not copy itself precisely. It echoes. It repeats structures. While altering details, it offers variation rather than novelty. What emerges from these echoes is not a moral lesson, but a recognition. Persistence matters. Adaptation matters. Attention matters. The ability to read environment, to understand limitation, and to respond thoughtfully determines longevity more than raw force. Catherine read her court, Frida read herself. The Red Queen's culture read the cosmos. Each operated within a framework that rewarded understanding over impulse. The pace of these lives was uneven. Catherine's days were filled with administration and decision making. Frida's days were interrupted by pain and recovery. The Red Queen's life, unknown in detail, was likely structured around ritual cycles and seasonal observances. Yet each life moved forward steadily, accumulating significance through repetition rather than climax. The absence of dramatic resolution does not diminish impact, it reinforces it. As memory stretches further, the distinctions between personal and historical blur. Frida's pain becomes cultural reference. Catherine's policies become abstract examples. The Red Queen's body becomes data, but Returning to the lived experience restores texture. It reminds us that these were not concepts, they were individuals navigating daily reality under constraint. They experienced fatigue, frustration, and uncertainty. They made choices without knowing how they would be remembered. History's calm surface hides this uncertainty. It presents outcomes without hesitation, paths without alternatives. But at the moment of decision, certainty rarely exists. Catherine did not know she would be called great. Frida did not know her self portraits would endure. The Red Queen did not know her tomb would be opened centuries later. They acted within their present, responding to immediate conditions. Legacy followed unintentionally. The quiet continuity of these stories encourages a slower engagement, a refusal to rush toward conclusion, a willingness to sit with complexity without resolving it. History does not require constant interpretation to remain meaningful. Sometimes it asks only to be observed, carefully allowed to unfold at its own pace, without pressure to deliver lessons or inspiration. As the narrative continues forward, untethered from urgency, it becomes clear that what survives is not spectacle, but structure, not drama, but repetition. The steady presence of individuals working within systems, adapting quietly, leaving traces that accumulate into significance over time. The world changes around them, but the patterns persist, layering gently, waiting patiently, as the long story of human endurance continues without interruption, without summary, without end. The movement of history remains slow and even, never hurried, never dramatic, just continuing in its familiar way, carrying traces of earlier lives forward without asking permission. The stories of Catherine, the Red Queen, and Frida do not conclude because history rarely offers clean endings. Instead, their influence diffuses, spreading outward into institutions, interpretations, and quiet cultural memory, where it lingers without urgency. Catherine's Russia continued after her death under rulers who inherited her structure without her discipline. The empire she expanded relied heavily on centralized authority and rigid hierarchy, systems that functioned efficiently until they no longer did. Her successors lacked her balance of pragmatism and restraint. They inherited her power, but not her patience. As years passed, the gap between ruler and ruled widened further, and the stability Catherine had protected began to harden into immobility. Her legacy was not undone quickly. It eroded gradually, as legacies often do, through accumulated misjudgment rather than sudden collapse. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers remained preserved, quoted as evidence of intellectual ambition. She admired reason, debate, and progress, but believed they had to be administered carefully, filtered through authority. She trusted ideas, but trusted control more. This approach shaped not only policy but culture, creating an environment where reform was discussed endlessly but implemented selectively. The contradiction became institutionalized, and later generations inherited it as tradition rather than choice. The Red Queen's influence remained entirely different. She had no laws, no writings, no decrees. Her impact existed in absence, the absence of inscription, the absence of biography, the absence of narrative certainty. This absence forced attention toward ritual symbolism, toward understanding power outside documentation. Her tomb became a reminder that not all authority requires explanation. Some forms of influence operate through placement, through association, through cosmic alignment rather than command. She disrupted modern assumptions simply by existing without clarification. Archaeologists returned to her burial repeatedly, measuring, testing, and analyzing. But every scientific insight produced new questions rather than closure. Her bones revealed age, health, and lineage. Her ornaments revealed status, but her role remained interpretive. She resisted being fully translated into modern categories, and that resistance preserved her dignity. She was not reduced to anecdote or spectacle. She remained intact, protected by silence. Frida's influence expanded differently again. It moved through emotion rather than structure, through identification rather than authority. Her work resonated with people who recognized themselves in pain, in contradiction, in refusal to soften reality. She became associated with resilience, but not the sanitized kind. She did not overcome pain. She lived alongside it, and that distinction mattered. Her legacy offered permission rather than instruction, permission to exist visibly within limitation, permission to refuse neat resolution. As her image circulated widely, there was a risk of simplification. Her face became iconic, her unibrow stylized, her clothing aestheticized. But beneath that surface, her work continued to speak quietly to those willing to look longer. Her paintings resisted comfort. They held tension. They asked viewers to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it. That quality preserved their power even as popularity grew. Across these three lives, the question of agency remained central. How much control did they truly have? Catherine exercised agency through mastery of system. Frida exercised agency through expression. The Red Queen exercised agency through ritual presence. Each faced boundaries defined by culture, body, or belief. None operated freely in the modern sense, but freedom is always contextual. It exists within limits, not outside them. History often celebrates rebellion because it is visible, but adaptation shapes longer arcs. Adaptation is less glamorous but more durable. Catherine adapted to autocracy and shaped it. Frida adapted to pain and transformed it. The Red Queen adapted to cosmology and embodied it. These adaptations allowed continuity, they allowed survival, they allowed presence across time. As centuries layered over these lives, their stories became tools, used in debates about power, gender, identity, and endurance. Each was pulled into narratives larger than herself. This is inevitable. History reuses material, it repurposes lives to explain new concerns. But beneath reuse, the original complexity persists, waiting beneath interpretation for those willing to slow down. The pace required to understand these figures is not fast. It demands patience. It requires resisting the urge to extract lessons too quickly. It asks for attention to nuance, contradiction, and unresolved tension. These stories do not resolve because the conditions that produce them have not disappeared. Power still isolates, expression still emerges from constraint, ritual still anchors meaning where language fails. Catherine's loneliness was structural. She ruled alone despite constant company. She trusted selectively. She measured affection carefully. Her authority depended on distance. This distance protected her but also confined her. She could not afford vulnerability. She could not step outside role without risk. Her emotional life remained secondary to governance, and that prioritization shaped both her success and her cost. Frida's loneliness was physical and emotional. She was surrounded by people, yet isolated by pain. She shared her inner world openly through art, but the body remained her private battleground. She invited viewers in, but could not be joined fully. Her work bridged distance without erasing it. She remained singular even in visibility. The Red Queen's loneliness is unknowable, but her burial suggests communal intention rather than isolation. She was placed deliberately, accompanied carefully, and integrated into sacred geography. Her identity relational. She existed within cosmic structure rather than individual narrative. This form of belonging contrasts sharply with modern individualism, but within her culture, it offered permanence beyond self. These differing forms of solitude reveal how cultures frame connection. Courts prioritize hierarchy. Art prioritizes expression. Ritual prioritizes alignment. Each offers belonging differently. Each imposes its own constraints, and individuals navigate these frameworks using the tools available to them. As time continues, the repetition of these frameworks becomes visible. New leaders inherit courts, new artists inherit bodies and histories, new discoveries reinterpret rituals. The surface changes, but the underlying patterns remain. Power demands performance. Expression demands exposure. Belief demands structure. Individuals respond with adaptation, negotiation, and endurance. The slow rhythm of this repetition makes history suitable for reflection rather than excitement. It unfolds best when allowed to breathe, when details are observed without urgency, when lives are considered not as symbols but as processes unfolding over time. These processes rarely follow clean arcs. They drift, they pause, they repeat, they accumulate meaning gradually. Catherine's days were filled with documents, meetings, and calculated decisions. Frida's days were shaped by physical limits and creative urgency. The Red Queen's days likely followed ceremonial cycles and social obligations. Each routine created identity through repetition. Identity was not declared once, it was reinforced daily through action. This daily reinforcement is where history lives, not in singular moments, but in sustained patterns. The decision to read rather than react, the choice to paint rather than retreat, the act of burial aligned with cosmology rather than ego. These repeated choices created continuity. They allowed influence to persist beyond lifespan. Memory operates similarly. It does not preserve everything. It selects, compresses, and emphasizes. What survives is often what repeats, what echoes, what finds relevance across contexts. These stories survive because their structures remain recognizable. They reflect ongoing human negotiation with limitation and power. As we continue drifting through these narratives, the absence of finality becomes comforting. There's no need for resolution. History does not require closure to remain meaningful. It requires attention, patience, the willingness to observe without rushing forward, the acceptance that some questions remain open by design. The stories of Catherine, the Red Queen, and Frida continue to exist side by side, not intersecting directly but resonating thematically. They form a quiet constellation of endurance, each illuminating different aspects of survival within constraint. They do not instruct, they accompany. They remain available for reflection whenever the pace slows enough to notice them. And so the narrative continues forward, steady and unbroken, layering observation upon observation, allowing history to remain what it has always been, a long, quiet accumulation of lives lived within systems larger than themselves, unresolved and ongoing, carried gently onward without pause. Time does not hurry these stories, and it does not demand novelty. It simply carries forward what already exists, layer by layer, letting meaning accumulate slowly rather than arrive all at once. The lives we are drifting through do not sit neatly in the past. They stretch outward, quietly influencing how power is imagined, how suffering is interpreted, and how endurance is measured. They remain present not because they shout for attention, but because they never fully disappear. Catherine's presence lingered in Russia long after her body was placed to rest. Her image was reproduced, her letters archived, her policies referenced. She became a standard against which later rulers were measured, often unfavorably. Her successors inherited a system that required constant management, and without her particular discipline, cracks appeared slowly but steadily. The court retained its rituals, the bureaucracy retained its layers, but the sense of control that Catherine maintained through vigilance began to loosen. She had understood that authority required constant reinforcement, and without that reinforcement, the structure she built became heavier and less responsive. Yet, even as that structure strained, it endured long enough to shape generations. Her reign became a reference point, a memory of competence in a landscape increasingly defined by inertia. This is often how influence works, not as perpetual dominance, but as comparison. The past becomes a measure used to highlight the present's shortcomings. Catherine did not need to remain alive to govern. She needed only to have governed well enough to be remembered. The Red Queen's presence did not operate through comparison. She offered no benchmark. She offered no narrative of success or failure. She existed as continuity, as evidence of a worldview in which authority was not individualized in the modern sense. Her burial suggested a society that understood power as relational, embedded within cosmic cycles rather than personal ambition. She was powerful because she occupied a necessary position within that cycle, not because she asserted dominance over others. This idea unsettles modern expectations. Modern narratives prefer identifiable leaders, documented actions, clear hierarchies. The Red Queen resists this. She reminds us that influence can exist without record, that authority can be exercised without proclamation. Her silence is not absence, it is structure. Frida's influence continued to grow as her work reached wider audiences. Over time, her paintings were interpreted through different cultural and historical perspectives. Ideas related to social context, cultural history, and artistic expression found relevance in her work because her visual approach was layered and open to multiple interpretations. Beneath these interpretations, however, a consistent foundation remained. Her work was closely tied to direct personal experience and careful observation. Instead of using distant symbolism, she focused on specific moments and perspectives, making her work direct and engaging for viewers. As her public recognition increased, a balance developed between visibility and understanding. Greater exposure created the possibility of simplification. Yet her paintings resisted being easily reduced. They required patience and attention. Viewers were encouraged to look closely, notice details, and spend time with the images. This emphasis on careful viewing helped preserve depth even as her reputation expanded. Her work was accessible, but it continued to demand thoughtful engagement. Across these figures, the idea of visibility appears in distinct ways. Catherine was highly visible as a ruler, with her actions closely recorded and evaluated. Frida used visibility intentionally, placing her own perspective at the center of her work. The Red Queen, in contrast, was defined by anonymity, with individual identity absorbed into formal structure and tradition. Visibility can create influence, but it can also introduce limitation through expectation and judgment. Invisibility can offer distance and protection, but it may also reduce recognition. Each of these women engaged with visibility according to the circumstances and systems of their time. Catherine controlled visibility through protocol and authority. She managed image carefully, projecting stability and competence. She understood that perception could reinforce power. Frida embraced visibility as honesty. She revealed what others concealed, using openness as defiance. The Red Queen existed beyond visibility, her significance embedded in placement rather than recognition. These approaches reflect not personality alone, but cultural context. The available options shape the chosen strategies. The cost of these strategies varied. Catherine's control required emotional restraint. Frida's openness required vulnerability. The Red Queen's silence required surrender to collective identity. Each choice preserved influence, but each exacted a price. No form of endurance is free. It demands trade offs, accepted consciously or not. As time progresses, the environments that produce these lives fade, but the pressures remain recognizable. New systems replace old ones, but the dynamics persist. Power still isolates, expression still exposes, ritual still structures meaning, individuals still navigate constraints using available tools. History changes costume, but the roles remain familiar. The repetition of these dynamics creates comfort rather than monotony. It reassures that struggle is not anomalous. It situates individual experience within broader pattern. This is why historical narratives soothe rather than excite when approached slowly. They contextualize, they normalize, they remind us that endurance is common, even when circumstances differ. Catherine's endurance was administrative. She sustained governance through discipline and attention. Frida's endurance was creative. She sustained identity through expression. The Red Queen's endurance was symbolic. She sustained authority through ritual continuity. Each form demonstrates that survival is not singular. It adapts to environment. These adaptations often occur quietly. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate gradually. This gradual accumulation resists spectacle, but it ensures longevity. The lives that endure are rarely loudest. They are the most consistent, the most attentive to context, the most willing to work within limitation rather than deny it. As historians revisit these figures, there is a temptation to extract lessons, to frame them as examples. But their true value lies in observation rather than instruction. They do not offer solutions, they offer presence. They demonstrate how individuals exist within systems without resolving those systems entirely. They show negotiation rather than triumph. Catherine did not abolish autocracy. She managed it. Frida did not escape pain. She articulated it. The Red Queen did not redefine power. She embodied it. These distinctions matter. They prevent romanticization. They ground the narrative in reality. Reality is rarely satisfying in a dramatic sense. It does not resolve cleanly. It does not reward effort proportionally, but it persists. And persistence is what history records most faithfully. As centuries unfold, the details of these lives blur, but their structures remain recognizable. The empress balancing ideology and control, the artist balancing expression and suffering, the ritual figure balancing individuality and cosmic order. These balances recur across cultures and eras. They form the backbone of human experience under constraint. The quiet continuity of these patterns invites a different kind of engagement, not excitement, but recognition, not judgment, but patience. It allows history to function as companion rather than spectacle. A. Presence rather than performance. In this slow drift, there's no need to rush toward conclusion. The value lies in sustained attention, in allowing narratives to unfold without interruption, in accepting that meaning emerges gradually through repetition and reflection rather than revelation. Catherine's letters still exist, waiting to be read. The Red Queen's tomb still rests, waiting to be reconsidered. Frida's paintings still hang, waiting to be looked at again. These stories remain accessible not because they are finished, but because they are open. They invite return, they invite re examination. As the narrative continues forward, it does so gently, without urgency, carrying these lives alongside countless others, each navigating limitation in their own way, each leaving traces that accumulate into history's long, unbroken flow, steady and patient, continuing on without pause. The current of history keeps moving without asking permission, and as it does, it carries familiar shapes forward into new environments, reshaping them just enough to survive. The structures that once supported Catherine's empire did not vanish when she did. They shifted, they adapted, they became quieter but no less present. The bureaucracy continued to breathe slowly, expanding and contracting under different rulers, each attempting to wear authority with varying degrees of competence. Some tried to imitate her, some rejected her outright. Most failed to understand that what made her effective was not personality, but persistence. She did not rely on inspiration, she relied on routine. That routine, outlasting her body, continued to influence how governance was imagined long after her name became ceremonial. The Russian court remained a space of performance, long corridors filled with whispered alliances and carefully managed appearances. The rituals continued because rituals stabilize uncertainty. They offer predictability environments defined by competition. Catherine understood this instinctively. She preserved ceremony not because she believed in its sanctity, but because she recognized its utility. The throne required theater to remain believable. Without it, power risked appearing arbitrary, and arbitrary power invites resistance. She preferred calculated dominance to chaotic assertion. Her successors struggled with this balance. Some leaned too heavily on spectacle, others attempted reform without discipline. The result was often stagnation rather than transformation. The machinery Catherine refined was not designed for rapid change. It was designed for endurance. That endurance came at the cost of flexibility, and eventually the cost became visible. But collapse is rarely immediate. It arrives slowly through inefficiency rather than rebellion. This slow erosion mirrors patterns seen far earlier in places like Palenque, where dynastic continuity depended less on individual rulers and more on symbolic alignment with cosmic order. The Red Queen's burial illustrates this principle vividly. Her placement near Bacal was not sentimental, it was structural. It reinforced the idea that rulership existed within balance rather than hierarchy. She was not secondary, she was complementary. Her silence functioned as stability. Maya civilization prioritized continuity over innovation. Temples were rebuilt atop older temples, each layer preserving memory while allowing renewal. This architectural layering mirrors historical layering. Lives stack upon one another, each influencing the next. without erasing it. The Red Queen's tomb remained untouched for centuries, not because it was forgotten, but because it was protected by reverence. The act of leaving it undisturbed was itself an expression of respect. Respect does not require visibility, it requires recognition of significance. The Maya expressed this through spatial relationships rather than inscriptions. The absence of her name does not diminish her importance, it elevates it beyond individuality. She became archetype rather than person. This transition is difficult for modern audiences to accept because it contradicts contemporary emphasis on identity. But within her context, it was powerfully affirming. She did not need to be named to be necessary. Frida's context demanded the opposite. She needed to assert identity explicitly because her environment attempted to erase or redefine it. Her paintings functioned as declarations. They refused reinterpretation imposed from outside. She did not offer ambiguity in intention, even when symbolism layered meaning, the emotional core remained unmistakable. She painted pain without metaphorical distance. This directness challenged viewers accustomed to aesthetic detachment. As her reputation grew, so did attempts to soften her edges. Museums contextualized her work within movements. Art historians debated classification, but her paintings resisted containment. They were too specific to become generic examples. They insisted on remaining personal. This insistence preserved their vitality. Her work did not become historical artifact. It remained active, engaging viewers across time because the experience it depicted was not bound to a single era. Pain does not age. It repeats. The repetition of pain across centuries creates unexpected resonance between lives that never intersected. Catherine's emotional isolation echoes in Frida's physical confinement. The Red Queen's ritual silence echoes in Catherine's controlled expression. These parallels do not imply equivalence. They highlight shared constraints. Different cultures impose different limitations, but the negotiation process remains similar. Individuals assess available options and choose strategies that maximize survival within those boundaries. Catherine focused on administration. Frida focused on expression. The Red Queen focused on ritual. None of these approaches were perfect. They were practical choices shaped by context rather than imposed ideals. This practicality is often overlooked in favor of dramatic narratives, but drama can obscure understanding. Practical decisions, by contrast, explain endurance. Endurance does not require finality, it requires adaptation. Adaptation rarely appears heroic, it often involves repeated, ordinary actions that seem small individually but accumulate over time. Catherine's careful review of documents, Frida's repeated artistic work, the Maya's repeated ceremonial practices. These actions maintain systems by reinforcing regularity. Regularity builds trust. Trust stabilizes structures. This principle applies at all scales. Large institutions and households alike rely on predictable routines to reduce uncertainty. When routines break, instability can follow. History contains countless examples of this dynamic, not because it is unusual, but because it is universal. Over time, interpretation evolves. The same actions are reconsidered through new perspectives. Catherine's policies are studied through historical and cultural frameworks. Frida's work is seen in the context of changing artistic analysis. The Red Queen's ceremonial role is reassessed as new research emerges. Each reinterpretation adds depth without erasing previous understanding. This accumulation of perspectives enriches comprehension rather than replacing it. This variability underscores the importance of patience in historical engagement. Quick conclusions distort, long attention clarifies. The stories that endure reward slow listening. They reveal patterns gradually. They offer comfort through familiarity rather than novelty. Comfort does not imply ease, it implies predictability. Knowing that others navigated constraint before us situates individual struggle within collective experience. This context reduces isolation. It reframes difficulty as shared rather than personal. Catherine likely understood this instinctively. She immersed herself in correspondence, philosophy, administration, not solely for governance, but for connection. She maintained dialogue with intellectuals across Europe, creating a network that mitigated isolation. Frida created connection through self representation, inviting viewers into her interior world. The Red Queen connected through ritual, binding community through shared symbolic practice. Connection mitigates vulnerability, power isolates, art exposes, ritual binds. These mechanisms operate differently but serve similar purposes. They maintain equilibrium between individual and system. Equilibrium is fragile. It requires constant adjustment. When adjustment ceases, systems stagnate or collapse. This principle applies equally to empires, artistic movements, and belief structures. History's long narrative is less about dramatic turning points and more about incremental recalibration. The recalibration process rarely attracts attention. It lacks spectacle. It unfolds quietly through administrative decisions, artistic experimentation, ritual repetition. These processes accumulate impact without announcement. They reshape environments gradually, ensuring continuity even amid change. As we continue drifting through these intertwined narratives, the emphasis remains on flow rather than destination. There's no final assessment to reach, no definitive conclusion to draw. The value lies in sustained presence, in allowing stories to unfold without forcing interpretation. Catherine's legacy remains contested. Frida's meaning continues to expand. The Red Queen's identity remains unresolved. These unresolved elements preserve engagement. They invite ongoing inquiry rather than closure. Inquiry sustains relevance. It keeps history active rather than archival. Active history participates in present understanding without requiring modernization. It does not need to reference contemporary frameworks explicitly to remain meaningful. It resonates through shared human dynamics. The dynamics of power, suffering, and endurance transcend temporal boundaries. They repeat in different configurations, adapted to context but recognizable in structure. This recognition fosters continuity. It bridges centuries without collapsing difference. Difference matters, context matters. Recognizing pattern does not erase specificity. It enhances it by situating unique experiences within broader frameworks. Catherine's autocracy differs fundamentally from Maya ritual authority. Frida's self expression differs from imperial administration. But the underlying negotiation with constraint unites them conceptually. Negotiation implies agency within limitation. It acknowledges restriction without surrender. This balance defines resilience. Resilience does not require optimism, it requires persistence. Persistence operates quietly, it favors repetition over revelation. The stories we are following exemplify this quiet persistence. They do not crescendo, they sustain. They continue because they are designed to endure rather than impress. As the narrative carries forward, it does so without interruption, maintaining rhythm rather than escalation, allowing the accumulation of detail to create texture rather than tension, continuing steadily, patiently, without pause, as history itself does, layer upon layer, life after life, pattern after pattern, flowing onward in a single, unbroken motion. The movement forward remains slow and unannounced, as it always has, and the figures we follow do not step aside to let time pass. They move with it, embedded within it, becoming part of its texture rather than markers along its edge. Catherine's Russia continued to operate on habits she reinforced rather than ideals she proclaimed. The clerk still copied documents by hand, the governor still waited for approval, the court still relied on proximity to favor, power remained personal even when it pretended to be institutional. This tension never resolved, it simply became normal. Normality is one of history's most effective disguises. It allows imbalance to persist without provoking alarm. Catherine herself had lived within imbalance. She governed vast territory while remaining constrained by expectation. She was sovereign, yet scrutinized, intellectual, yet dismissed, commanding, yet constantly evaluated. She compensated not by rebellion, but by refinement. She refined process. She refined image. She refined distance. She understood that proximity invites challenge, while distance preserves authority. This understanding shaped her personal relationships, her public appearances, and her governance style. She did not seek affection, she sought stability. Stability rarely feels kind, but it feels reliable. This reliability allowed her reign to persist with minimal upheaval. She did not eliminate conflict, she managed it. She redirected ambition, she redistributed reward. She recognized that suppression breeds resentment, but controlled opportunity creates compliance. This approach did not generate devotion, but it generated order. Order for an empire of her scale was sufficient. The cost of this order was emotional austerity. She permitted little indulgence in vulnerability. She surrounded herself with advisors, yet trusted few. She maintained correspondence, yet guarded intimacy. Her private self narrowed as her public role expanded. This narrowing is common among those who govern extensively. They become defined by function rather than experience. The self becomes tool rather than refuge. Frida experienced narrowing of a different kind. Her body imposed limits. Her will could not overcome. She did not govern territory. She governed sensation. She managed pain through articulation. She transformed physical constraint into expressive focus. This focus intensified her work. It sharpened her gaze inward. She did not escape suffering. She mapped it. Mapping suffering gave it form, and form gave it duration. Pain without articulation dissipates. Pain rendered visible endures. Frida's paintings endure because they do not seek resolution. They document presence. They acknowledge continuity. They accept that discomfort can coexist with beauty without requiring justification. This acceptance challenged audiences accustomed to redemptive narratives. She did not redeem pain, she inhabited it. The Red Queen inhabited symbolism rather than narrative. Her identity dissolved into role. This dissolution protected her from scrutiny while preserving her significance. She became inseparable from ritual context. This inseparability ensured continuity. Burial placement reinforced alignment with cosmic order rather than personal achievement. She was remembered through position rather than story. Position carries meaning without explanation. It communicates hierarchy, relationship, and intention simultaneously. It bypasses narrative and appeals directly to structure. The Maya understood this intuitively. They encoded authority spatially rather than textually. This encoding required participation rather than observation. One experienced it by moving through space rather than reading description. This experiential approach contrasts with Catherine's textual legacy and Frida's visual one. Each culture prioritized different modes of preservation: text, image, space. These modes shaped how memory functioned. Text invites analysis, image invites empathy, space invites orientation. None are neutral. They guide interpretation through form. Interpretation evolves as contexts change, but form constrains possibility. Catherine's letters frame her as administrator and philosopher. Frida's paintings frame her as subject and witness. The Red Queen's tomb frames her as axis and balance. These frames persist regardless of interpretive lens. They anchor, meaning even as understanding shifts. Shifting understanding reflects evolving values. What earlier generations ignored, later ones foreground. This selective attention reshapes narrative emphasis without altering foundational structure. The Red Queen's rediscovery reframed Maya gender dynamics. Frida's reevaluation reframed artistic canon. Catherine's reassessment reframed imperial governance. These reframings did not alter history, they altered engagement. Engagement deepens through repetition. Each return reveals new detail previously overlooked. This gradual revelation mirrors how these figures lived. Their significance accumulated slowly. They did not announce transformation, they embodied it incrementally. Incremental change resists spectacle. It operates beneath attention thresholds. This subtlety allows it to persist unchallenged. It integrates into environment until it feels inevitable. History favors inevitability because it discourages disruption. Once a pattern feels natural, it becomes difficult to contest. Catherine normalized female autocracy through competence rather than rhetoric. Frida normalized embodied expression through repetition rather than manifesto. The Red Queen normalized female authority through ritual placement rather than proclamation. These normalizations endured because they avoided confrontation. They integrated quietly. Quiet integration does not imply passivity. It implies strategy. It recognizes that systems resist overt challenge but absorb gradual adaptation. This approach requires patience. Patience requires acceptance of delay. Acceptance of delay requires emotional discipline. Emotional discipline shaped Catherine's demeanor. Frida's discipline shaped her craft. The Red Queen's discipline shaped ritual continuity. Each exercised restraint differently, but restraint was central. Restraint preserved agency within constraint. Constraint defines historical experience. No era lacks it. No individual escapes it. The illusion of freedom varies, but limitation persists. This persistence creates continuity across centuries. It allows disparate lives to resonate without collapsing difference. Resonance comforts because it suggests pattern. Pattern suggests predictability. Predictability reduces anxiety. History approached this way becomes soothing rather than unsettling. It affirms that struggle is not anomaly. It situates difficulty within enduring human condition. The figures we followed did not resolve their conditions. They navigated them. They adapted. They persisted. Persistence is history's quiet protagonist. It lacks charisma but outlasts drama. As generations pass, the details of these lives blur, but their adaptive strategies remain instructive, not as lessons but as observations. They show how individuals inhabit systems without dissolving into them entirely. They maintain selfhood through function expression, or symbolism. Selfhood does not require visibility, it requires coherence. Catherine maintained coherence through order, Frida through articulation, the Red Queen through alignment. Each approach sustained identity within constraint. Identity sustained under pressure acquires density. It becomes layered. It resists simplification. This resistance preserves relevance. It invites continued engagement rather than closure. Closure would diminish these stories by implying resolution where none existed. Their value lies in continuation, in their ability to remain open to reinterpretation, in their refusal to settle into moral clarity. History rarely offers moral clarity. It offers context. It reveals complexity. It encourages patience. These qualities align naturally with slow narration. They reward sustained attention. They unfold gently. The narrative continues not by accelerating but by expanding outward, incorporating additional lives, additional patterns, each echoing familiar dynamics with unique inflection, each reinforcing the sense that history less a sequence of events than a continuous field of human adaptation flowing steadily onward without interruption, without conclusion, carrying forward quietly, layer by layer, as it always has. The flow does not pause here. It simply widens, absorbing more lives, more repetitions, more familiar shapes, moving through different environments, each one shaped by limits they did not choose and systems they did not design. Catherine's Russia was not unique in its reliance on habit and hierarchy. It echoed earlier empires and foreshadowed later ones. The reliance on paperwork, ritualized obedience, and controlled access to authority appears again and again because it works long enough to feel permanent. Permanence is an illusion, but it is a useful one. It allows people within the system to behave as if stability is guaranteed, which in turn reinforces that stability, at least for a time. Those who exist at the center of such systems rarely experience that stability emotionally. They are buffers. They absorb pressure. They translate chaos into order. Catherine functioned as such a buffer. She absorbed ideological tension, regional conflict, and courtly ambition and processed it into policy. This processing required detachment. Detachment required sacrifice. She traded intimacy for effectiveness. She accepted loneliness as operational cost through repeated routines, through reliance on structured tasks. The more predictable her days became, the more manageable her responsibilities felt. This predictability provided stability, though it also limited the range of experiences she encountered. She became highly skilled and increasingly organized. A similar pattern appears in Frida's work, though in a different form. Her environment constrained her movement, while her artistic output expanded outward. She encountered unpredictability in daily circumstances, but sought consistency through creative practice. Painting offered structure when circumstances were irregular. She chose repetition deliberately, returning to familiar subjects not for display, but for accessibility. She could engage fully without leaving her environment. This consistent focus created depth and precision that few could replicate. Her paintings do not avoid challenges, they engage them. They allow ideas to unfold without pressure. This measured approach is important. It prevents escalation. It guides the viewer calmly, even when the subject matter is complex. The calmness comes from transparency. When intentions are clear, there is no sudden disruption. The Red Queen's context minimized disruption through ritual. Regular patterns structured daily life. The Maya calendar organized activities so thoroughly that any deviation was noticeable. Repeated practices aligned collective activity with broader cycles. This alignment reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty creates instability. Structured repetition reduced unpredictability by embedding individuals within consistent frameworks. Survival strategies shape culture. They determine what is valued, what is repeated, what is preserved. Over time, these values become normalized. They feel inherent rather than constructed. History reveals their constructed nature by tracing origin and evolution. This revelation does not dismantle value, it contextualizes it. Contextualization reduces moral absolutism. It encourages patience. Patience aligns with slow narration. Slow narration aligns with the lived experience of these figures. They did not experience life as sequence of highlights. They experienced it as continuum of management, expression, and alignment. Catherine's days blended into one another through administrative repetition. Frida's days blended through cycles of pain and creation. The Red Queen's days blended through ritual observance. Blending creates continuity. Continuity creates memory without emphasis. This memory feels stable rather than dramatic. Drama requires contrast. Contrast disrupts calm. This narrative avoids disruption. It maintains equilibrium. This equilibrium allows listener to drift rather than brace. History becomes background rather than stimulus. It accompanies rather than demands. As we drift further, the accumulation of similar patterns across disparate contexts reinforces familiarity. Familiarity breeds ease. Ease encourages sustained attention. Sustained attention reveals nuance. Nuance deepens understanding. Understanding here is not analytical, it is experiential. It comes from repeated exposure to similar dynamics, power negotiated, expression constrained, ritual repeated. These dynamics repeat across centuries, across cultures, across individuals. Recognition of repetition fosters quiet insight without articulation. This insight does not need to be stated. It exists as ambient awareness. It settles gradually. It does not seek conclusion. The figures we follow remain present because they exemplify navigation rather than resolution. They show how to exist within limitation without erasure. They demonstrate continuity under pressure. Continuity is history's constant. It persists regardless of ideology, technology, or belief. It flows through administration, art, and ritual alike. It binds disparate lives into shared pattern. This pattern does not conclude, it extends. As the narrative continues, it does so seamlessly without marking progress or anticipating end, maintaining a steady cadence that mirrors the endurance it describes, carrying forward quietly, unbroken, allowing history to remain what it has always been, a slow, continuous movement of human lives adapting gently within structures larger than themselves, flowing onward without pause. The continuation feels almost indistinguishable from what came before, and that is precisely the point, because history rarely announces when it moves from one phase into another. It drifts, it overlaps, it repeats familiar shapes in slightly altered forms, and those living within it rarely notice the transition until long after it is settled into place. The systems Catherine reinforced did not disappear when inefficiency crept in. They adjusted margins, they absorbed delay, they compensated through redundancy. This compensation masked decline. It allowed routine to persist even as effectiveness waned. Routine has remarkable staying power. Once established, it resists disruption because it offers predictability. Predictability comforts both those who benefit from power and those subjected to it. It reduces uncertainty, even when outcomes are unfavorable. This reduction often outweighs dissatisfaction. People tolerate constraint more easily than chaos. Catherine understood this implicitly. She preserved routines, even when reform tempted her. She knew change introduced instability, and instability threatened authority. Authority depends less on force than on expectation. When individuals expect compliance, they comply reflexively. This reflex sustains systems without constant enforcement. It becomes cultural rather than coercive. The Russian court functioned on this principle. The Maya ritual calendar functioned similarly. Frida's internal discipline followed comparable logic. She established routine to manage unpredictability. This convergence underscores how different environments produce similar strategies. Strategy does not require awareness, it emerges through adaptation. Individuals respond to constraint by refining behavior that minimizes friction. These behaviors accumulate into pattern. Pattern solidifies into culture. Culture persists beyond individual lifespan. This persistence explains why personal influence often outlasts personal presence. Catherine's administrative habits became institutional. Frida's expressive honesty became aesthetic reference. The Red Queen's ritual alignment became spatial memory. These elements persisted because they integrated into broader structures. They did not rely solely on individual agency, they embedded themselves within collective practice. Collective practice diffuses responsibility, it reduces vulnerability. When responsibility is shared, it becomes harder to assign blame or credit. This diffusion stabilizes systems. It prevents collapse triggered by individual failure. It also obscures accountability. This obscurity frustrates modern analysis, but supports longevity. Longevity rarely aligns with justice, it aligns with manageability. Systems that persist are those that minimize disruption, not those that maximize fairness. Catherine's empire prioritized control over equity. Frida's art prioritized expression over comfort. The Maya prioritized cosmic balance over individual recognition. These priorities shaped outcomes. They determined what endured. Endurance does not equal approval. It reflects compatibility with environment. History records what fits, not what deserves. This distinction matters. It reframes historical significance as descriptive rather than prescriptive. These lives matter because they persisted, not because they resolved moral questions. This reframing invites calm engagement. It removes urgency to judge. It allows observation without expectation of lesson. History becomes landscape rather than argument, a place to move through slowly, not a debate to win. Movement through landscape encourages attention to texture rather than destination. The texture of Catherine's correspondence, the texture of Frida's brushwork, the texture of Maya stone. These textures convey lived experience more effectively than summary. They require time. They reward patience. Patience aligns with the rhythm of endurance. Endurance unfolds gradually. It lacks climax. It accumulates quietly. This accumulation is soothing because it mirrors natural processes, growth, erosion, sedimentation. These processes shape environments without spectacle. They proceed regardless of observation. History follows similar patterns. It accumulates layers of decision and consequence. These layers compress into structure. Structure guides future behavior unconsciously. People inherit systems without knowing their origin. They follow paths worn smooth by repetition. This unconscious inheritance defines much of human behavior. Catherine inherited autocracy. Frida inherited artistic marginalization. The Red Queen inherited ritual obligation. They did not choose these frameworks. They navigated them. They adapted. They left traces that influenced subsequent navigation. Navigation implies movement within bounds. It accepts boundary without surrender. This acceptance is pragmatic. It prioritizes survival over idealism. Pragmatism dominates historical behavior. Idealism appears intermittently, but pragmatism sustains continuity. The sustained continuity of these narratives reinforces familiarity. Familiarity reduces cognitive effort. It allows attention to drift without disengaging. This drifting is conducive to calm listening. The narrative does not demand focus, it offers presence. Presence does not require novelty, it requires consistency. The consistency here lies in repeated exploration of how individuals inhabit systems. The specifics vary, but the process remains recognizable. This recognition fosters quiet connection. Connection across centuries dissolves temporal distance. It situates listener within ongoing human pattern. This situating comforts because it normalizes struggle. It reframes individual experience as part of larger continuum. This reframing reduces isolation. Isolation characterized Catherine's personal experience. Frida's physical isolation intensified her introspection. The Red Queen's ritual isolation elevated her symbolic role. Isolation manifests differently, but it recurs. Isolation often accompanies authority, expression, and ritual significance. Isolation sharpens awareness. It forces inward orientation. Catherine compensated with correspondence. Frida with self representation. The Red Queen with ceremonial alignment. These compensations preserved equilibrium. Equilibrium is dynamic. It requires constant adjustment. When adjustment ceases, imbalance grows. But imbalance rarely announces itself. It accumulates gradually. This gradual accumulation maintains surface calm while internal stress increases. History often records the moment of rupture but neglects the long adjustment preceding it. This narrative corrects that emphasis by dwelling within adjustment rather than rupture. Dwelling within adjustment reveals endurance mechanisms. It highlights repetition, compromise, and incremental change. These mechanisms lack drama but sustain life. They deserve attention because they represent typical experience rather than exception. Exceptional events attract attention, but typical processes shape reality. The lives we follow exemplify typical navigation under atypical circumstances. They demonstrate how individuals manage constraint through routine rather than rebellion. Rebellion disrupts but rarely sustains. Routine sustains but rarely transforms. History privileges sustenance because it persists. Transformation attracts interest but often fades. This imbalance explains why administrative records outnumber revolutionary ones. Catherine produced volumes of documentation. Frida produced concentrated visual testimony. The Maya produced enduring architecture. These outputs reflect different priorities but share emphasis on durability. Durability ensures presence across time. Presence across time invites reinterpretation. Reinterpretation renews relevance. This renewal keeps history active. It prevents stagnation. Active history adapts to new perspectives without losing foundational structure. This adaptability mirrors the adaptability of the individuals it records as the narrative continues. It maintains this emphasis on adaptation rather than outcome. It flows without segmentation, without signaling progression, allowing the listener to remain within the rhythm, anticipate conclusion. This approach mirrors the lived experience of history itself, which does not mark chapters or announce transitions, but moves steadily, quietly, carrying forward familiar patterns through changing contexts, unbroken and patient, continuing on. The movement continues without marking itself, because nothing here requires emphasis to justify its existence. It simply unfolds, layered over what came before, quietly extending patterns that were already in motion. The structures Catherine relied upon continued to reward obedience more than insight, and this preference shaped the personalities that rose within them. Competence mattered less than predictability. Those who could be relied upon to behave consistently were favored over those who introduced uncertainty. This preference did not encourage brilliance, it encouraged compliance. And compliance is easier to manage at scale than innovation. Innovation introduces friction. Friction slows routine. Routine preserves authority. This logic governed not only empires but households, workshops, and ritual centers. It is a logic grounded in conservation effort. When systems grow large, they conserve energy by reducing variation. Catherine's Russia exemplified this tendency, but it was far from unique. It echoed Rome, China, Persia, and countless others. The names differ, the processes repeat. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity dulls perception. Once dulled, perception stops questioning. This state is not ignorance, it is adaptation. People adapt to what persists. They normalize constraint. They build lives within it. They find meaning inside limitation rather than beyond it. This adaptive capacity explains how systems endure long after their founding logic fades. Catherine adapted to inherited autocracy. Frida adapted to inherited pain. The Red Queen adapted to inherited cosmology. Inheritance shapes possibility. It defines starting point. Individuals rarely begin from neutrality. They begin embedded within context. This embeddedness influences not only action but imagination. It determines what feels possible. Possibility is culturally constructed. What one era considers inevitable, another considers unthinkable. This relativity complicates retrospective judgment. It cautions against projecting contemporary expectations backward. These figures did not fail to transcend their context, they operated within it. Their significance lies in navigation, not escape. Navigation requires attention. Attention requires presence. Presence requires pacing. Rushed movement increases error. Slow movement allows correction. This principle applies equally to governance, art, and ritual. Catherine paced reform carefully. Frida paced expression through repetition. The Maya paced life through calendar cycles. Pacing stabilized experience. Stabilization reduces anxiety. Anxiety disrupts cohesion. Cohesion sustains systems. This chain explains why gradualism dominates historical change. Sudden shifts attract attention but rarely endure. Gradual shifts embed themselves quietly. They become difficult to dislodge because they feel natural. Naturalness is constructed through repetition. What repeats becomes expected. What is expected becomes invisible. Invisibility is powerful. It allows systems to operate without scrutiny. The Red Queen's authority was invisible in this sense. It did not need assertion, it was assumed. Frida's pain became visible deliberately to counteract imposed invisibility. Catherine balanced between visibility and distance to maintain authority. These choices reflect differing relationships with scrutiny. Scrutiny alters behavior. It introduces performance. Performance consumes energy. This energy expenditure limits sustainability. Catherine minimized scrutiny through protocol. Frida accepted scrutiny to preserve honesty. The Red Queen avoided scrutiny through ritual anonymity. These strategies managed energy differently. Energy management is survival strategy. Long-term endurance requires careful allocation. Those who expend energy impulsively burn out. Those who regulate expenditure persist. This regulation often appears unemotional or repetitive, but it sustains continuity. Continuity is undervalued in dramatic narrative. It lacks climax, yet it defines lived experience. Most lives consist of maintenance rather than transformation. History mirrors this reality more than fiction admits. The maintenance work of empire, art, and ritual fills far more time than moments of rupture. Maintenance involves care, repetition, and attention to detail. Catherine reviewed documents. Frida prepared pigments. The Maya aligned structures. These acts rarely appear heroic, but they accumulate impact. They preserve systems. They transmit knowledge. They ensure survival. Survival does not imply comfort, it implies persistence. Persistence may coexist with suffering. Catherine endured isolation. Frida endured pain. The Red Queen endured erasure of individuality. These costs accepted implicitly. They were not negotiated openly. They were absorbed as part of role. Role absorbs identity over time. When individuals occupy roles long enough, distinction between self and function blurs. This blur reduces internal conflict but increases rigidity. Catherine became inseparable from office. Frida became inseparable from expression. The Red Queen became inseparable from symbol. This inseparability preserved influence but constrained evolution. Evolution requires flexibility. Flexibility threatens stability. This tension defines historical change. Systems oscillate between rigidity and adaptation. They adjust when pressure accumulates, but resist until adjustment becomes unavoidable. This resistance delays transformation but ensures continuity. Delay shapes outcome. Gradual change produces different results than abrupt shift. It allows integration. It reduces backlash. It preserves coherence. Catherine's cautious reforms illustrate this principle. Frida's gradual stylistic development reflects it. Maya architectural layering embodies it. Layering preserves past within present. It avoids erasure. It acknowledges continuity. Layered history feels dense rather than linear. It invites exploration rather than summary. This density suits slow narration. It allows listener to remain within atmosphere rather than track progression. Atmosphere matters more than chronology here. The mood is one of steady observation rather than anticipation. The narrative does not build toward resolution, it settles into rhythm. This rhythm mirrors endurance. Endurance does not hurry, it continues. As we remain within this flow, the boundaries between individual stories soften. They blend into shared pattern, power negotiated, expression constrained, ritual repeated. These elements recur across contexts, creating familiarity. This familiarity soothes, it reassures that complexity does not require urgency. Urgency disrupts calm. This narrative avoids disruption. It maintains equilibrium. Equilibrium invites drift. Drift allows absorption. Absorption deepens engagement without effort. The deeper engagement becomes, the less need there is for conclusion. Conclusion implies separation. It signals end. This narrative resists ending because history resists ending. It continues regardless of observation. The figures we follow recede into pattern without disappearing. They remain present as reference rather than focus. They exemplify navigation rather than exception. This exemplification sustains relevance across time. Relevance here is subtle. It does not demand attention. It remains available. This availability allows return. Listeners can re-enter at any point without confusion. The narrative does not require a beginning or end. It functions as a continuum. Continuum aligns with historical reality. Lives overlap. Influences intersect. Patterns repeat. This continuity offers orientation through familiarity. It situates individual experience within a larger flow. As the flow continues, it carries forward not only these figures but countless others, each navigating limitations through adaptation, each contributing to the accumulation of history, each reinforcing the sense that endurance is common, that persistence is typical, and that beneath the surface of change, patterns move steadily onward, unbroken, unhurried, continuing without pause. The flow remains uninterrupted because interruption implies a boundary, and boundaries are rarely perceived in real time. They are recognized later, after distance forms. What those living within these systems experienced was not transition, but continuation, a sense that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to require little adjustment. This sameness is not stagnation, it is equilibrium. Equilibrium allows people to function without constant reassessment, and that conservation of attention is essential for endurance. Catherine relied on this equilibrium. She allowed the machine of empire to operate at a steady pace, neither accelerating too quickly nor slowing enough to invite failure. She understood that dramatic reform attracts resistance while gradual adjustment passes unnoticed. She did not attempt to redefine authority. She refined its operation. She corrected inefficiencies quietly. She replaced individuals rather than structures. She preferred repair over redesign. This approach extended her control more effectively than broad reforms ever could. Repair requires familiarity. Catherine knew her system well enough to recognize subtle issues. She noticed delays in correspondence, recurring patterns of oversight, repeated concerns. These observations informed her adjustments. She did not announce changes, she implemented them quietly. This discretion preserved stability. It maintained order. Abrupt changes unsettle structures. When systems shift suddenly, routines are disrupted, and people must readjust. This readjustment consumes resources and can slow function. Large systems therefore prioritize continuity over rapid alteration, emphasizing steady operation above radical improvement. Frida's life followed a similar logic, though expressed differently. She encountered irregular conditions that disrupted her routine and could not rely on predictability in daily circumstances. She compensated by establishing a consistent creative practice. This practice provided stability when external conditions did not. She continued to paint even when movement was limited, returning to familiar subjects and repeating motifs. This repetition anchored her activity and maintained continuity. Repetition may seem mundane, but it serves an essential purpose. It builds familiarity and reduces mental effort. Familiarity allows focus to settle rather than scatter. This steadiness produces calm, even under challenging conditions. Frida's paintings convey this calm, not because they depict ease, but because they accept circumstances without urgency. This approach encourages viewers to observe thoughtfully rather than react immediately. The Red Queen's environment similarly emphasized repetition. Ritual schedules structured daily life, and ceremonies aligned with celestial cycles. This alignment embedded individuals within a larger rhythm, reducing uncertainty in daily decisions. Events followed predictable patterns, which reassured the community and framed life within a consistent sequence. Predictable sequences support endurance, and endurance supports continuity. Continuity preserves culture. This explains why ritual persists across civilizations even when it seems inefficient. It addresses a fundamental need for orientation. Without orientation, experience can fragment, destabilizing routines and overall functioning. Catherine structured her court through protocol. Frida structured her life through creative practice. The Red Queen structured her society through symbolism. These approaches differed in form but shared a common function. They provided stability and reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty shapes behavior across contexts. People seek frameworks that make experience manageable. These frameworks need not be perfect, they need only be consistent. Consistency reassures. Reassurance does not remove challenges, but it makes them manageable. Challenges are easier to address when they fit within a pattern or routine. Frida's challenges were mitigated through creative practice. The Red Queen's responsibilities were structured by ceremonial patterns. Catherine's constraints operated within defined roles. Organizing circumstances in this way prevented them from overwhelming daily functioning. Sustained functioning requires focus. Maintaining focus supports long-term contribution. These figures shaped history not through dramatic gestures, but through steady presence. They remained in their roles long enough to influence the environments around them. Presence is underrated. It lacks spectacle. Yet presence enables accumulation. Accumulation creates influence. Influence persists beyond individual lifespan. This persistence defines historical significance. Historical significance often appears impersonal. It reduces lives to outcomes. This reduction obscures experience. The narrative here resists that reduction by lingering within process rather than outcome. It attends to how endurance feels rather than what it produces. Endurance feels repetitive. It feels slow. It feels uneventful. This uneventfulness is precisely what allows continuation. Drama exhausts. Systems cannot sustain constant intensity. They require periods of low stimulation to recover. This recovery enables longevity. Longevity shapes memory. What lasts becomes reference. What disappears becomes footnote. History privileges endurance because it shapes subsequent conditions. Catherine's administrative choices influenced governance norms. Frida's expressive honesty influenced visual language. The Red Queen's ritual alignment influenced spatial symbolism. These influences are subtle. They operate through expectation rather than instruction. They guide behavior unconsciously. People inherit patterns without questioning origin. This inheritance ensures continuity even when awareness fades. Awareness fluctuates. Interest rises and falls. Rediscovery occurs. These cycles do not alter underlying pattern. They refresh engagement. They reintroduce context. They remind new audiences of existing structure. Rediscovery of the Red Queen did not change her significance. It revealed it. Frida's reevaluation did not create her relevance. It acknowledged it. Catherine's reassessment did not redefine her impact. It contextualized it. These acts of recognition adjust narrative emphasis without altering reality. Narrative emphasis reflects contemporary concerns. When societies seek models of governance, they examine administrators. When they seek authenticity, they examine artists. When they seek balance, they examine ritual figures. This selective attention reveals more about the present than the past. The past remains unchanged. It waits. It does not hurry. It does not adapt to interpretation. It simply exists, layered and dense. History becomes what we notice within it. This noticing shifts over time, but the underlying material persists. Persistence allows return. Return deepens understanding. Each encounter reveals new aspect previously overlooked. This gradual revelation suits slow narration. It encourages lingering rather than consumption. Consumption treats history as product. Lingering treats it as environment. This narrative invites lingering. It avoids segmentation. It maintains steady cadence. It allows listener to remain within atmosphere rather than track progression. Atmosphere here is one of quiet continuity. There are no climaxes, no revelations, no conclusions. There's only movement forward at constant pace. This pace mirrors lived experience more accurately than dramatized accounts. Lived experience rarely provides closure. Issues persist, they evolve, they overlap, they do not resolve neatly. This lack of resolution frustrates narrative expectation but reflects reality. History does not end, it continues through adaptation. Adaptation is not triumph, it is necessity. It does not imply improvement, it implies survival. Catherine adapted to autocracy. Frida adapted to pain. The Red Queen adapted to cosmology. These adaptations allowed them to function within constraint. Functioning within constraint does not require approval, it requires acceptance. Acceptance does not mean endorsement, it means recognition of limitation. This recognition frees energy for navigation rather resistance. Resistance exhausts quickly. Navigation conserves energy. Conservation supports longevity. This pragmatic logic underlies historical endurance. As the narrative continues, it remains within this logic. It does not accelerate. It does not conclude. It maintains steady flow, allowing patterns to repeat without apology, allowing familiarity to deepen rather than bore, allowing history to unfold as it does in reality, slowly, quietly, without marked beginnings or endings, carrying forward lives and systems together in one continuous movement that does not seek resolution but persists patient and unbroken into whatever comes next. The current keeps moving in the same direction, not circling back, not restarting, just widening slightly as more detail settles into place, like sediment building on a riverbed. The sensation of sameness comes not from repetition but from consistency, because real history does not reinvent itself every few moments. It relies on the same pressures, the same compromises, the same slow negotiations between individual will and structural weight. This is still the same topic, the same thread, just stretched gently forward. Catherine's world did not feel historic to those living in it. It felt administrative. Days were filled with documents, appointments, procedures. The weight of empire expressed itself not in grand moments but in routine, decisions that had to be made regardless of mood or health. She could not pause the state to reflect. She had to keep the machine running. This necessity flattened emotional extremes. It discouraged introspection. It rewarded steadiness. She learned to inhabit that steadiness fully because instability would have been noticed immediately. Being noticed was dangerous. Visibility invited interpretation. Interpretation invited challenge. Catherine managed this by becoming predictable. She trained her court to expect certain responses, to recognize certain patterns. This predictability reduced friction. It allowed others to adjust themselves around her rather than force adjustment from her side. This was not passivity, it was control, exercised through consistency. Consistency also defined Frida's later years, though imposed rather than chosen. Her body limited her mobility, but not her attention. She returned repeatedly to the same symbols, the same visual language, because it allowed refinement rather than exploration. Refinement deepens rather than expands. It trades novelty for density. Each repetition added nuance rather than difference. This approach mirrored the way pain revisits the body, not as new experience, but as familiar presence. She met it with familiarity rather than resistance. Familiarity transforms threat into companion. What is known feels manageable, even if unpleasant. Frida's work communicates this quiet management. She does not dramatize pain, she coexists with it. This coexistence feels calm rather than tragic. It invites the viewer to remain rather than recoil. The Red Queen Society institutionalized familiarity through ritual. People knew what would happen next, what ceremonies would occur, what symbols would be invoked. This knowledge reduced existential anxiety. It framed life as sequence rather than chaos. The Queen's role within this sequence mattered because it anchored meaning. She was not exceptional, she was essential. This distinction matters. Exception disrupts pattern. Essential reinforces it. Reinforcement stabilizes systems. Stable systems persist. Persistence creates history. This chain operates regardless of moral evaluation. History records persistence, not virtue. Catherine persisted. Frida's work persisted. The Red Queen's symbolism persisted. They remained present because they integrated into structures that outlasted them. Outlasting oneself requires alignment with broader forces. Catherine aligned with administrative necessity. Frida aligned with embodied truth. The Red Queen aligned with cosmic order. Alignment reduces resistance. Resistance drains energy. Alignment conserves it. This conservation supports endurance. Endurance feels uneventful. It lacks turning points. It consists of adjustment rather than transformation. This is why historical endurance feels monotonous when described quickly. It requires slow narration appreciated. When rushed, it collapses into summary. When slowed, it reveals texture. Texture is the accumulation of small differences within sameness. The slight shift in tone of a letter, the variation in brushstroke, the subtle repositioning of stone. These differences matter because they reflect adaptation, they show responsiveness within constraint, they demonstrate life continuing rather than stagnating. Stagnation implies cessation, adaptation implies movement. The narrative here reflects adaptation. It does not stop, it adjusts subtly. It explores similar themes through different angles without resetting. This is not a loop, it is a spiral, always moving forward, never returning to exact point. Spirals characterize historical experience. We revisit similar conditions under altered circumstances. We face familiar pressures with modified tools. This creates recognition without repetition. The figures discussed embody this. They face timeless pressures through context-specific means. Catherine's pressure was scale. Frida's was pain. The Red Queen's was symbolism. Scale demands delegation. Pain demands expression. Symbolism demands precision. Each response reflects context while participating shared pattern of negotiation with limitation. Negotiation requires patience. Patience requires acceptance. Acceptance reduces urgency. Urgency disrupts calm. This narrative maintains calm by avoiding urgency. It does not rush toward insight. It allows understanding to emerge gradually. Gradual emergence mirrors learning. We rarely understand systems immediately. We grasp them through exposure, through repetition, through noticing pattern. This slow acquisition feels natural. It aligns with how memory forms. Memory strengthens through repetition, not intensity. Intensity creates spikes. Spikes fade quickly. Repetition creates grooves. Grooves endure. History favors grooves. The grooves of administration, art, and ritual remain visible long after dramatic events fade. Catherine's reforms mattered because they embedded into groove. Frida's imagery mattered because it repeated until it became language. The Red Queen's placement mattered because it fixed spatial memory. Spatial memory differs from narrative memory. It does not tell story. It situates presence. It allows people to orient themselves without explanation. This orientation feels grounding. It reduces cognitive effort. It fosters calm. Calm supports continuity. This narrative aims for continuity rather than revelation. It maintains steady cadence. It avoids segmentation. It flows. Flow allows listener to drift without losing thread. The thread here is endurance under constraint. This thread remains constant even as examples shift slightly. This consistency reassures. It signals that we are still within same conceptual space. That space is not defined by dates or events, but by human behavior under pressure. How people manage responsibility, how they cope with limitation, how they preserve meaning. These questions recur across history. They do not resolve, they repeat. Repetition does not imply failure, it implies persistence. The human condition does not seek resolution, it seeks balance. Balance shifts but never stabilizes permanently. This shifting balance keeps history moving. Without conclusion, Catherine managed authority and legitimacy. Frida managed production and creative work. The Red Queen managed ceremonial roles and cosmological obligations. These arrangements required continuous adjustment. They were never fixed. This ongoing adaptation defines their activities. Lives shaped by adaptation do not conclude neatly. They taper, fade, and merge into broader context. Influence continues through structures rather than individual recognition. This structural continuity is less visible but more lasting. Endurance supports relevance. Relevance encourages revisiting. Revisiting strengthens familiarity. Familiarity promotes stability. This cycle sustains engagement without forcing attention. As the narrative progresses, it remains within this cycle. It does not seek a climax. It does not require a conclusion. History remains a continuous process of human activity, unfolding gradually, layer by layer, without interruption, without reset, carrying forward the same functional patterns across different lives, consistent, forward moving, unbroken. The movement remains steady, intentionally. This steady pace reflects how these activities unfolded. There is no acceleration, no indication that major change is imminent. For participants within these systems, time advanced gradually, days blending through repeated routines and obligations. This gradual progression allows systems to endure, reduces abrupt reactions, and maintains operational continuity. Catherine functioned within this gradual progression. She did not experience her role as a series of milestones. She engaged in continuous operational tasks that renewed each day. Repetition supported efficiency. Familiarity enabled consistent decision making. She could identify which actions required immediate attention and which could be deferred. This structured approach distinguished her management from approaches driven by rapid changes. Systems are stabilized through predictability. Predictability allows others to coordinate effectively. The Russian nobility adjusted to Catherine's routines, aligning their actions with her established patterns. This alignment reduced conflict and channeled activity into manageable processes. Competition was not eliminated, it was organized. This organization maintained balance. Pressure does not disappear, it accumulates, shifts, and appears differently over time. Stabilization allows systems to adapt rather than collapse. Adaptation requires flexibility within constraints. This flexibility often appears subtle, involving adjustment rather than complete overhaul. Catherine adjusted personnel rather than institutions. Frida adjusted technique rather than subject. The Maya adjusted architecture rather than cosmology. These adjustments preserved core structures while accommodating change. This balance between preservation and adaptation supports endurance. Endurance often looks conservative because it resists abrupt disruption, but it is not static. It evolves incrementally, incorporating changes gradually enough to avoid destabilization. This slow incorporation makes transformation difficult to detect until it is complete. Its subtlety protects change from resistance. Resistance occurs when adjustments disrupt established routines. Established routines anchor systems. Disrupting them can trigger defensive responses. Systems therefore maintain routines carefully. Catherine managed reforms quietly, framing changes as continuation rather than deviation. Frida also framed adjustments as continuation. Her style evolved while remaining recognizable. She did not abandon her methods but refined them. This refinement maintained coherence, allowing observers to track development without confusion. Consistent structures preserved engagement. The Red Queen's environment limited overt change entirely. Core cosmology remained stable. Architectural forms accumulated without replacement. Symbolic patterns repeated without reinvention. This consistency preserved cultural frameworks across generations. Resilience does not remove challenges. It allows systems to persist while accommodating them. This persistence is pragmatic. It accepts constraints without undermining function. This approach is historically common and characterizes most operational experience. Operational patterns rarely follow dramatic arcs. They do not build toward a single climax or resolve cleanly. They persist through routine. This persistence may appear subtle when summarized. Extended attention reveals structure. Structure emerges through accumulation of small details, the sequence of actions, repeated motifs, alignment of processes, and orderly patterns. These details matter because they reveal operational dynamics. Process explains endurance more than isolated outcomes. Outcomes attract attention but fade quickly. Process sustains systems over time. Historical accounts often privilege outcomes in summary, but substance lies in process. This analysis focuses on process. It highlights repetition as essential because repetition itself maintains continuity. Pressure accumulates gradually. When threshold reached, adjustment occurs. But even then, change often preserves familiar elements. This preservation eases transition. It maintains continuity while accommodating necessity. Catherine's reforms preserved autocracy while modernizing administration. Frida's work preserved self portraiture while evolving style. Maya architecture preserved cosmology while adapting form. These examples illustrate adaptive continuity. Adaptive continuity allows systems to survive transformation without rupture. This survival ensures presence across time. This presence invites ongoing engagement. Engagement here is not analytical, it is experiential. It involves inhabiting rhythm rather than extracting lesson. This inhabitation fosters calm. It allows listener to remain within narrative without anticipation. Anticipation creates tension. Tension disrupts calm. This narrative avoids tension by refusing escalation. It maintains steady flow. It mirrors endurance rather than drama. As we continue within this flow, the distinction between individual stories softens. They blend into shared human pattern. Individuals become expressions of structural negotiation. This does not erase individuality, it contextualizes it. Contextualization deepens understanding. It situates personal experience within collective framework. This framework reduces isolation. It affirms that struggle is common. Common struggle does not trivialize suffering. It normalizes it. Normalization reduces shame. It allows acceptance. Acceptance enables navigation. Navigation supports persistence. Persistence is history's defining feature. It outlasts ideology, it outlasts innovation, it outlasts individual lives, it carries forward quietly. The narrative continues in this quiet mode. It does not reset, it does not loop, it advances through deepening rather than progression. It remains on the same topic, endurance within constraint, observed through different lives and systems, still moving forward, still widening slightly, still unbroken, carrying history onward as it always has, patient, layered, and continuous. The flow keeps its shape and it keeps its direction because there's nowhere else for it to go except forward, quietly, without ceremony. This is still the same river of endurance, the same long negotiation between human intention and structural weight, and it does not suddenly transform just because time passes. The surface may look similar, but beneath it, new layers keep settling, subtle shifts accumulating that only become visible when viewed from a distance. Catherine's administration did not collapse under its own repetition. It became heavier, slower, more resistant to deviation. This heaviness was not immediately perceived as weakness. Heaviness feels like solidity. Solidity reassures. People trust what feels solid even when it no longer moves easily. This trust extended the life of the system long after its flexibility diminished. She had built something that could survive mediocrity, and that is often more valuable than brilliance. Brilliance attracts attention. Attention invites challenge. Mediocrity blends into expectation. Expectation is rarely questioned. This is why large systems often reward average behavior rather than exceptional insight. They prefer reliability over vision. Catherine understood this instinctively. She did not surround herself with idealists. She surrounded herself with functionaries. This choice stabilized her reign, but it also shaped what followed. A system optimized for routine struggles to respond creatively when conditions change. Yet even this limitation unfolded slowly. There was no single moment when inefficiency announced itself. It seeped in through delay, through backlog, through redundancy, layered atop redundancy. The system continued to operate. It simply required more effort to produce the same results. This gradual decline felt normal to those living within it because they adapted incrementally. Adaptation masked deterioration. Masking deterioration is another form of endurance. It allows continuation without confrontation. Frida experienced a parallel process within her own body. Her condition did not suddenly worsen once and remain static. It fluctuated. It demanded adjustment. She adapted, constantly modifying posture, technique, pace. She did not announce decline. She integrated it. This integration preserved her ability to work. Work provided structure. Structure provided purpose. Purpose reduced despair. This sequence illustrates how routine functions as emotional scaffold. Without routine, experience fragments. Fragmentation overwhelms. Frida's repetition was not limitation, it was survival strategy. She returned to familiar subjects, not because imagination failed, but because familiarity anchored her amidst instability. Anchoring appears clearly in the Red Queen's context. Ritual organized society within long standing cycles. These cycles did not promise control, only continuity. Events followed established patterns rather than individual decisions. This approach distributed responsibilities over time rather than concentrating them in single actors. Management of activity is central to continuity. Catherine organized personnel through delegation. Frida organized her creative practice systematically. The Red Queen Society operated through ritual schedules. These methods differ, but they serve the same purpose. They maintain steady operations and allow activity to continue within regular patterns. Disruptions can affect overall organization. When procedures are inconsistent, systems may lose efficiency. Continuity depends on maintaining regular processes, even when progress is gradual. Sudden changes can interrupt operations. Consistent attention preserves stability. Stability requires ongoing effort. Routine work is repetitive and often unremarkable. It involves monitoring, adjusting, and maintaining established procedures. This work consumes time but produces results gradually. Catherine spent much of her reign on these routine tasks. Frida maintained her creative workflow systematically. The Maya preserved ritual schedules over centuries. The value of routine emerges over time. Effects accumulate slowly rather than appearing immediately. Most impact comes from consistent operations rather than isolated actions. Highlighting singular events compresses narrative, they provide a simple cause and effect story. Routine work resists compression and requires extended context to be fully understood. This account provides that context, presenting historical continuity as a gradual process rather than a series of isolated events. Close attention reveals patterns. Patterns show adaptation over time. Adaptation explains how systems continue to function. Consistent processes shape long-term outcomes. Across these cases, the focus is on operating within established procedures rather than attempting rapid change. Systems and individuals act within defined structures to maintain operations. Maintaining consistent processes ensures ongoing function. Catherine operated administratively. Frida worked methodically. The Red Queen Society maintained symbolic procedures. These approaches preserved continuity. Continuity does not require external recognition. It relies on practical effectiveness. Effectiveness depends on context. Administration supports governance. Creative practice supports consistent output. Ritual supports social coordination. These approaches endure because they meet ongoing structural requirements. Certain procedural needs remain consistent: the need for organization, alignment, and structured timing. These needs shape activity across contexts, creating observable patterns. Patterns allow predictability, and predictability supports steady operations. Comfort emerges from predictability. Predictability reduces cognitive load. It allows attention to relax. This relaxation aligns with slow narration. It encourages drifting rather than focusing. The drifting here is intentional. It mirrors how history is lived rather than how it is summarized. People do not experience history as sequence of events. They experience it as ongoing present, punctuated by minor adjustments. This narrative stays within that ongoing present. Staying within present avoids retrospection bias. It does not impose significance prematurely. It allows actions to remain ambiguous. Actions gain meaning later through accumulation. This delayed meaning aligns with endurance. Endurance does not seek meaning immediately. It prioritizes survival. Meaning emerges gradually through repetition and reflection. This emergence feels organic rather than imposed. Catherine's policies gained significance as their consequences unfolded. Frida's work gained resonance as audiences returned to it. The Red Queen's burial gained importance as context expanded. These significances were not inherent at inception. They developed over time. Time reveals pattern. Pattern informs understanding. Understanding deepens without urgency. This gentle deepening suits the rhythm of this narrative. There is no need to signal progression. The continuation is implicit. The same themes persist because the same pressures persist. The narrative remains on topic because the topic is broad and continuous. Endurance does not fragment into chapters. It stretches. Stretching allows integration. New details fold into existing framework rather than creating new one. This integration maintains coherence. Coherence sustains calm. Calm allows continuation. As this flow continues, it carries forward quietly, not looping, not restarting, not resolving, just expanding slightly as more texture settles in, remaining on the same thread of human endurance within structure, still moving forward at the same measured pace, still unbroken, still patient, still allowing history to be what it most often is: a long, steady process of adaptation unfolding without announcement, without climax, without end. The continuation does not require a shift in direction because direction was never sharply defined to begin with. It moves the way lived experience moves, incrementally, without announcement, carrying familiar weight forward, while adding almost imperceptible layers. Catherine's court continued to wake each morning into routines that felt inevitable. These routines created an atmosphere where nothing seemed urgent unless it disrupted the pattern. Urgency was treated as a flaw, not a signal. Systems like hers learned to distrust sudden change because sudden change implied instability. Instability threatened legitimacy. Legitimacy mattered more than efficiency. This emphasis shaped behavior. People learned to perform continuity. They repeated gestures, phrases, procedures, not because they were optimal, but because they were recognized. Recognition reduced risk. When everyone knows the script, deviation stands out. Deviation invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites consequence. This quiet pressure encouraged conformity without explicit enforcement. Frida encountered a similar pressure internally. Her body enforced boundaries without negotiation. She could not ignore signals. She had to listen. This listening required attentiveness rather than resistance. Attentiveness slowed her pace but sharpened perception. She noticed subtleties because she had time. She worked within constraint rather than against it. This choice preserved energy. Energy conservation defines endurance. You do not survive by expending everything at once. You survive by measuring output. This measurement becomes habitual. It shapes rhythm. Rhythm stabilizes experience. Catherine's reign developed rhythm. Frida's practice developed rhythm. Ritual societies develop rhythm intentionally. Rhythm replaces excitement with predictability. Predictability calms. Calm does not mean absence of tension. It means tension distributed evenly rather than concentrated. Even distribution prevents rupture. This is why slow pressure feels tolerable while sudden shock overwhelms. These historical figures lived within slow pressure. They adapted gradually. They rarely experienced release. They learned to function within constraint. Functioning within constraint produces a specific psychology. It values pragmatism over aspiration. It prioritizes maintenance over innovation. It encourages incremental improvement rather than radical transformation. This psychology permeates institutions and individuals alike. It becomes cultural norm. Catherine's Russia absorbed this norm. Administration became ritualized. Art became regulated. Language became formalized. These forms provided stability but reduced spontaneity. This trade-off was accepted because stability was scarce. Spontaneity felt dangerous. Frida's context introduced variation within formal repetition. Her subjects were repeated, but the characteristics of each iteration differed. This variation preserved complexity while maintaining structure. It allowed communication of layered meaning without disrupting procedural order. The Red Queen Society emphasized strict consistency. Symbols carried meaning independently of individual variation. Patterns remained stable across iterations. This reduced variation in activity but ensured alignment with long-term schedules. Stability was maintained within established parameters. Trade-offs are inherent in historical decision-making. No option provides only advantage. Each adjustment involves compromise. Long-term operations rely on accepting these compromises without overemphasis. Such acceptance allows systems to function steadily. Expectation management shapes operational continuity. Catherine organized her court according to rules rather than personal preference. Frida structured creative output according to method rather than circumstance. The Red Queen Society followed cycles rather than individual decisions. Clear expectations reduce disruption within routines. Routine reduces disruption. When events follow established sequences, operational processes proceed smoothly. This steadiness allows focus on patterns rather than individual occurrences. Pattern recognition improves consistency and facilitates orderly function. Continuity is supported through repeated practice rather than novelty. Introducing unexpected variation requires extra adjustment and can interrupt ongoing operations. A steady approach prioritizes consistency over dramatic change. Historical processes often operate in areas between recorded events. Records highlight specific moments, but the majority of activity consists of repetition, maintenance, and gradual adjustment. These underlying processes constitute the majority of operational reality. Within these ongoing processes, Catherine maintained governance incrementally. Her authority became embedded in regular practice. Compliance was achieved through predictable routines rather than intervention. Frida concentrated creative production within a limited operational capacity. Each output carried more significance because of controlled quantity, but procedures remained consistent. The Red Queen's presence was maintained spatially rather than narratively. Placement within ceremonial and burial contexts conveyed significance without additional interpretation. Location provided a structural reference for understanding. Structured orientation reduces operational uncertainty. Clear sequences and predictable routines provide guidance for timing and activity. Consistency in scheduling and procedure supports reliable functioning. Comfort sustains endurance. Endurance sustains history. As generations passed, systems built by Catherine required caretaking. Caretakers inherited routines without questioning origin. Origin matters less than function. Function continued, so questioning felt unnecessary. This inertia preserved structure but obscured intent. Intent faded into habit. Habit governs behavior quietly. Frida's influence similarly persisted through habit. Her imagery became reference point. Others returned to it instinctively. Habitual reference indicates integration. Integration signifies endurance. The Red Queen's symbolism integrated into broader cosmology. Her individuality dissolved into archetype. This dissolution extended relevance beyond biography. Archetypes persist longer than individuals. They detach from specific context. They adapt. Adaptation without transformation characterizes endurance. Archetypes shift subtly to remain recognizable while accommodating change. This subtlety prevents rupture. Rupture marks endings. This narrative avoids endings because endurance avoids them. History rarely ends cleanly. It transitions. It bleeds into new forms. This bleeding feels continuous. Continuity reassures. It implies stability even amid change. This paradox defines historical experience. Change occurs within continuity, not against it. This nuance requires slow exploration. It resists summary. Summary simplifies. Simplification distorts. This narrative resists distortion by remaining detailed and gradual. It allows complexity without intensity. Intensity would demand resolution. Resolution would imply ending. There's no ending here, there's only continuation. Continuation does not mean repetition, it means progression within constraint. The same themes recur because constraints recur. These constraints shape human response consistently. As this continuation moves forward, it maintains the same measured pace. It does not announce transitions. It allows one observation to bleed into the next. This bleeding mirrors how understanding forms. Understanding accumulates quietly. It does not arrive fully formed. It grows through exposure. This exposure requires time. Time is provided here. The provision of time is intentional. It creates space for drifting. Space allows the mind to settle. Settling reduces resistance. Resistance fades into acceptance. Acceptance aligns with endurance. Endurance remains the central thread. It binds these lives across context. It explains their persistence. It contextualizes their limitations. It reframes their choices. Choices appear constrained but meaningful within context. Meaning does not require freedom, it requires coherence. Coherence was maintained. Maintained coherence allowed systems to function beyond individual lifespan. This function defines historical significance. Significance emerges from continuity, not disruption. As this flow continues, it remains anchored in the same exploration of how people and systems persist under pressure, how they manage expectation, how they trade excitement for stability, how they accept repetition, survival. still moving forward gently, still on the same topic, still unbroken, still refusing conclusion, still allowing history to unfold as it most often does, slowly, quietly, without declaration, carrying on. The movement remains steady and unannounced, carrying forward the same quiet examination of endurance as it stretches across time and circumstance. Catherine's later years settled into a rhythm that felt almost self sustaining. She no longer needed to assert authority loudly because authority had become ambient. It existed in architecture, in procedure, in expectation. People acted as though she would always be there, and in doing so, they extended her presence beyond her physical participation. This is one of the subtle mechanisms of power. Power becomes most durable when it no longer needs reinforcement. Reinforcement draws attention. Attention provokes analysis. Analysis can unravel legitimacy. By contrast, ambient authority fades into background noise. It becomes part of environment rather than subject of thought. This transformation marked Catherine's success. She had transitioned from ruler to fixture. Fixtures are rarely questioned, they are simply navigated around. Navigation requires familiarity. Familiarity emerges from repetition. This repetition shaped the lives of those within her system. They learned how to move, how to speak, how to wait. Waiting became skill. Waiting filled time. Waiting reduced impulse. Impulse threatens stability. Frida also learned waiting, though her waiting occurred within the body. She waited for pain to recede enough to work. She waited for strength to return. She waited for moments of clarity. These waits structured her days. They slowed her life, but deepened awareness. She did not rush, because rushing was impossible. This impossibility reframed time. Time became resource rather than obstacle. Resource management applies to both empires and organized activities. Both require careful allocation of effort and capacity. Both encounter difficulties when demand exceeds available resources. Catherine increased capacity through bureaucracy. Frida increased capacity through focused practice. The Red Queen Society increased capacity through repeated ritual sequences. These expansions represent adaptive responses to existing constraints. Adaptation does not remove constraints, it works within them. This process becomes habitual. Habits persist. Habits outlast individual participation. This persistence explains why long lived systems appear impersonal. They are accumulations of coordinated practices layered over time rather than the product of a single actor. These accumulated layers create operational density. Density slows change. Slow change supports predictability but resists rapid innovation. Innovation carries potential disruption. Systems designed for longevity prioritize gradual adjustment over abrupt shifts. This preference explains why inefficiencies persist. They are familiar and manageable. Control is often procedural rather than absolute, but the perception of control supports stability. Participants behave differently when operational processes are clear and structured. This perception reduces disorder. Catherine's administration reinforced order through visible organizational structures. Frida reinforced personal control through repeated techniques. The Red Queen Society reinforced cosmic alignment through ritualized schedules. Belief in stability shapes behavior as reliably as actual conditions. When participants operate under the assumption that systems function predictably, their actions reinforce continuity. This self sustaining dynamic underpins long term persistence. Endurance may appear passive but requires ongoing maintenance. Maintenance includes reinforcing protocols, correcting deviations, and integrating minor adjustments. These tasks rarely attract attention but prevent systemic disruption. Disruption creates noticeable events, but dramatic events are uncommon in sustained processes. Historical narratives often exaggerate drama, misrepresenting typical operational reality. Most activities unfold gradually, with adjustments and persistence rather than climactic events. Gradual adjustment does not indicate aimlessness. It reflects activity guided by established structure rather than immediate outcomes. This approach allows continuation without overextension. Catherine advanced institutional stability incrementally. Actions responded to immediate procedural needs, but the cumulative effect produced long-term structure. Frida developed her visual system through repeated practice. Focus was narrow, but overall resonance expanded. The Red Queen's influence extended through ritualized placement. Individual variability diminished, but symbolic function increased. Reduction of individual emphasis often accompanies sustained systems. Personal details fade while structural impact endures. This trade-off is common. Historical records preserve operational effect more reliably than personal narrative. Function persists because it continues to operate. Systems generally avoid scrutiny until failure occurs. This operational invisibility protects them. Catherine's administration became a baseline of governance. Frida's imagery became an enduring visual system. The Red Queen symbolism provided spatial orientation within ritual structures. These functions integrated seamlessly into broader frameworks. Integration reduces operational friction. Friction creates attention. Attention invites intervention. Intervention risks disruption. Avoiding friction preserves long-term continuity. Continuity does not guarantee qualitative judgment. It ensures persistence. Persistence is neutral. It continues regardless of evaluation. Historical records document continuation without assigning moral value. Evaluation changes over time. What was once acceptable may later be reconsidered. What was once innovative may become conventional. These shifts occur gradually and do not negate endurance. They provide context. Context allows reinterpretation. Frida's work acquires new significance as frameworks evolve. Catherine's governance is analyzed through modern perspectives. The Red Queen's symbolic structures are examined differently. These reinterpretations coexist with original function. They add layers without replacing prior operations. Layers accumulate incrementally. They deepen understanding rather than redirect it. The narrative here mirrors this pattern, adding layers sequentially. Understanding is cumulative. New information integrates with existing frameworks. Integration maintains coherence while increasing depth. Depth is achieved through time. Sequential observation allows connections to form. These connections strengthen comprehension without introducing abrupt changes. Abrupt changes can disrupt system observation. This narrative maintains steady progression. It allows examination to continue in an unbroken sequence. Sustained observation supports continuity. Attention can follow patterns without requiring dramatic shifts. Regularity anchors the process. Anchoring maintains the operational thread. Continuity under constraint remains central because structural constraints persist. Social and organizational parameters evolve slowly, generating similar patterns across contexts. Responses vary in form but align in function. They preserve stability, manage operational limits, and support continuity. This alignment explains recurring historical patterns. Recurrence does not imply stagnation. It reflects adaptation within defined limits. Limits structure activity, shape processes, and guide creative or administrative output. Creativity functions within structural constraints, focusing resources efficiently. Governance operates within constraints to maintain order. These dynamics coexist, they complement one another. Complementarity is evident in these cases. Catherine employed structured innovation within rigid frameworks. Frida applied systematic approaches to guide creative output. The Red Queen Society relied on consistent symbolic frameworks to support collective organization. Frameworks provide reference points, define boundaries, concentrate resources, and preserve core operations. Concentrated structures produce durable outputs. Outputs persist beyond immediate circumstances. They migrate across contexts, retaining core functionality while adapting to new conditions. This adaptability supports continued operation. Endurance favors approaches that integrate gradually rather than demanding abrupt transformation. Gradual integration prevents disruption and allows long term stability. Slow, incremental adjustment characterizes lasting change. Rapid shifts invite instability. This pattern recurs throughout history and reinforces the preference for incremental adaptation. This narrative models incremental progression. Each observation transitions into the next seamlessly, reflecting continuous, unbroken development over time. Fading does not erase, it blends. This blending creates continuity. Continuity supports calm. Calm allows continuation without fatigue. Fatigue ends narratives prematurely. This narrative resists ending by pacing itself. Pacing is deliberate. It mirrors how institutions and individuals conserve energy. They avoid peaks. They maintain baseline. This baseline sustains operation. Operation continues until resources deplete. Resource depletion occurs slowly when managed well. This slow depletion extends lifespan. Catherine managed imperial resources to delay depletion. Frida managed physical resources to extend creative life. The Red Queen Society managed symbolic resources to maintain cohesion. Cohesion prevents fragmentation. Fragmentation accelerates decline. Cohesion requires shared understanding. Shared understanding emerges from repetition. Repetition reinforces memory. Memory anchors identity. Identity sustains continuity. Identity here is not personal but systemic. It defines how things are done. This definition persists even as actors change. This persistence explains why systems feel larger than individuals. Individuals pass through systems. Systems remain. This asymmetry shapes historical impact. Catherine mattered because she shaped system. Frida mattered because she shaped language. The Red Queen mattered because she anchored cosmology. These impacts endure because they integrated into structures that continue to operate. Structures do not require constant narration. They exist quietly. Quiet existence suits this storytelling approach. It avoids spectacle. It invites observation. Observation without judgment fosters understanding. Understanding reduces anxiety. Anxiety disrupts rest. This narrative supports rest by maintaining neutral tone. Neutrality does not imply indifference, it implies balance. Balance maintains equilibrium. Equilibrium supports endurance. As this continuation flows onward, it remains firmly within the same exploration of human persistence within constraint. It does not loop back, it does not reset, it builds gently upon what has already settled, adding weight without disruption, still on the same topic, still moving forward at the same measured pace, still unbroken, still refusing conclusion, allowing history to continue unfolding as an ongoing process of adjustment and survival, quietly and without end. The continuation settles back into the same steady current, not because it lacks direction, but because direction has already been chosen and does not need reaffirmation. Catherine's presence lingered even when she withdrew from direct action because systems she had shaped continued to behave as though she was still watching. This illusion of oversight mattered more than actual supervision. It encouraged self regulation. People corrected themselves preemptively. They anticipated expectations rather than waiting for instruction. This anticipation reduced friction and preserved order without visible force. Force exhausts resources, expectation conserves them. This conservation explains why long lasting systems rely more on habit than coercion. Habit internalizes control, it turns external pressure into internal guideline. Once internalized, it requires little energy to maintain. Frida internalized discipline in a different register. She learned how much effort she could expend without collapse. She measured days, not by hours, but by tolerance. This intimate calibration produced consistency. Consistency enabled continuation. Continuation allowed work to accumulate. Work accumulation created presence. Presence sustained relevance. Relevance does not demand approval, it demands recognition. Recognition emerges when something fits seamlessly into shared understanding. Frida's imagery fit because it spoke in familiar symbols, even when expressing personal experience. This familiarity allowed audiences to receive it without resistance. Resistance wastes energy. Energy scarcity shapes behavior. Catherine avoided resistance by framing policies as extensions of existing order rather than radical departures. This framing softened opposition. People resist disruption more than control. By presenting control as continuity, she minimized challenge. The Red Queen Society exemplified this principle at cultural scale. Symbols did not innovate abruptly, they evolved subtly. This subtlety maintained coherence across generations. Each generation inherited symbols already laden with meaning. They did not question them, they inhabited them. Inhabitation differs from belief. Belief requires active affirmation. Inhabitation simply occurs. People live within frameworks without examining them. This unexamined existence stabilizes societies. It reduces cognitive load. It allows attention to focus on immediate survival rather than abstract justification. Survival does not require philosophy, it requires routine. Routine anchors daily life. It structures time. Time structure reduces anxiety. Anxiety drains capacity. Reducing anxiety preserves function. Function emerges as central. Systems that operate consistently persist even when imperfect. Perfection requires additional resources and scrutiny. Imperfections tolerated within predictable parameters are less disruptive. This tolerance explains why complex systems endure. Catherine's administration contained inefficiencies, but they were consistent. Predictability mattered more than optimization. Participants could plan around known inefficiencies, but not around sudden changes. This stability reinforced operational continuity. Consistency fosters coordination. Coordination reduces conflict. Conflict disrupts operations. This sequence supports long term persistence. Frida's routines maintained consistency within her creative practice. Working within known constraints ensured continued output. Structured repetition reinforced operational reliability. Routine may appear restrictive, but it conserves resources by narrowing available options. Reduced options simplify decision making, allowing attention and effort to focus on essential tasks. The Red Queen's ritual environment minimized variation. Actions followed prescribed forms, predictable procedures, reduced uncertainty, and maintained structural alignment. Structured processes support system coherence. Coherence sustains identity within the system. Identity stabilizes behavior. Behavior reinforces structure. Structure persists. This loop underlies historical continuity. Continuity may appear static when observed briefly, but over time it reveals gradual transformation. Transformations are incremental rather than abrupt. Adjustments accumulate without overturning existing frameworks. Incremental adjustments preserve operational legitimacy. Legitimacy underwrites authority. Authority maintains order. Order reduces disruption. These priorities shape decision making across contexts. Catherine's approach prioritized order over experimentation and legitimacy over innovation. This conservatism limited short term change but ensured operational stability over time. Frida's approach prioritized structural consistency while allowing methodical variation in output. This balance enabled sustained productivity without destabilizing her practice. The Red Queen Society prioritized cosmic alignment over individual discretion. This approach preserved system cohesion but constrained variation. These trade offs reflect the operational values shaped by context. Context dictates available options. Options under constraint reveal operational patterns more clearly than intent. Outcomes emphasize persistence rather than dramatic results. Persistence defines functionality over spectacle. This narrative highlights persistence by maintaining a steady analytical pace. Steady presentation allows understanding of cumulative processes rather than isolated events. Patterns emerge gradually. Associations form through repeated observation. Incremental observation strengthens comprehension of system dynamics. This gradual accumulation suits analysis of long term endurance. The examples illustrate continuity under constraint. They demonstrate structural adaptation across individuals and institutions without relying on linear progression or climactic events. Analysis shifts, focus fluidly from individuals to systems to broader culture. Unfolding demonstrates that many operational decisions were ordinary at the time. Immediate actions contributed to later significance. Recognition of impact emerges after continuity is established. Persistence does not require immediate acknowledgement. It ensures functional survival. Catherine maintained governance to sustain order. Frida maintained her practice to continue production. The Red Queen Society maintained ritual structures to preserve systemic cohesion. Enduring structures generated later recognition. Context shapes practical meaning. Meaning changes as circumstances evolve. This evolution extends relevance without altering foundational structures. Relevance persists because essential functions continue to operate effectively. Administration, creative work, and ritualized practices meet recurring structural needs. These needs remain consistent across different settings and support ongoing continuity. Anchoring prevents drift into abstraction. This account remains grounded in observable practices and operational sequences. It avoids dramatization, which could obscure how continuity is maintained over time. Efficiency is achieved through predictable patterns. Distribution of tasks and allocation of resources prevent overload. Overload interrupts stable operation. Predictability ensures steady functioning. As continuity continues, existing practices are reinforced rather than replaced. Reinforcement strengthens operational stability without requiring additional intervention. Stability develops gradually. Incremental reinforcement over time increases reliability. Observed routines integrate into existing structures. Across contexts, practices are maintained through repetition and habituation. Operations favor continuity over novelty. Steady repetition supports persistence. Persistence aligns with structural integrity. It maintains alignment and prevents fragmentation. Fragmentation would require corrective adjustment, which carries risk. Consistent alignment avoids such disruption. Orientation remains consistent across functional domains. Specific details may change slightly, but reference points remain identifiable. Familiarity supports sustained operation. Familiarity allows accumulation of operational depth. Layered routines build resilience. Depth improves understanding of functional processes without relying on isolated events. Observations here focus on structure. They convey procedural dynamics rather than narrative or dramatic elements. Practices continue through habitual application rather than extraordinary actions. Persistence does not end abruptly. It continues into ongoing operation. Processes proceed without formal conclusion and extend beyond single observations. Operational continuity manages conflicts through layering rather than elimination. When elements conflict, additional protocols, clarifications, or intermediate steps are added. These layers do not remove all tension but reduce immediate disruption. Accumulated complexity supports mature practices. Stability results from integrated adjustments. Adjustments may lack elegance but maintain reliable persistence. Simplification can introduce risk. Layered continuation sustains endurance. Catherine's administration exemplified layered continuity. Each new protocol referenced previous practices, reinforcing stability and enabling predictable outcomes. Reliability was prioritized over optimization because consistent routines reduce uncertainty. Frida's creative practice followed similar principles. She refined a defined set of motifs rather than creating entirely new forms continuously. This refinement ensured recognition and maintained consistency in output. Repetition reinforced coherence within her creative routines. The Red Queen's ritual system maintained order through fixed, repeated practices. Structured repetition preserved alignment across generations. Individual variation was incorporated into durable and stable patterns. Across these cases, the principle is consistent. Endurance depends on incremental reinforcement, layered adaptation, and continued application of established routines rather than dramatic transformation. Practices persist because routines continue reliably, constraints are managed, and operational sequences are maintained over time. Connection also sustained ritual societies. The Red Queen's imagery connected individual lives to cosmic narrative. This narrative distributed meaning beyond personal circumstance. People felt part of larger pattern. Patterns reassure. They suggest order beyond chaos. Order does not eliminate suffering. It contextualizes it. Context reduces despair. Despair paralyzes. Endurance requires avoiding paralysis. This avoidance appears again and again across history. Avoidance of paralysis shapes institutions and habits. People design systems not to achieve perfection but to prevent breakdown. Breakdown is feared more than stagnation. This fear guides conservative decision making. Catherine's reluctance to dismantle flawed structures reflects this fear. She preferred known inefficiency to unknown outcome. This preference stabilized her reign but limited adaptability. Adaptability eroded slowly. This erosion was not perceived as threat until much later. Delayed perception characterizes systemic decline. Decline feels normal while it occurs gradually. People adjust expectations downward. This adjustment masks deterioration. Only when shock exceeds adaptive capacity does collapse occur. This threshold often lies far in future. Frida's body imposed frequent thresholds. She learned to recognize them. She adjusted before collapse. This preemptive adaptation preserved function. She did not wait for crisis. She responded to signals early. This attentiveness extended her creative lifespan. Attentiveness requires presence. Presence slows pace. Slow pace enhances perception. Enhanced perception deepens experience. This deepening appears in her work. The Red Queen's society institutionalized attentiveness through ritual timing. Ritual synchronized collective attention. This synchronization fostered cohesion. Cohesion strengthened resilience. Resilient societies absorb stress without fracture. Absorption again emerges as theme. Absorbing stress rather than deflecting it prevents concentration. Concentrated stress causes failure. Distributed stress dissipates energy slowly. This dissipation extends lifespan. Catherine distributed stress across administrative layers. Frida distributed pain through expression. The Red Queen Society distributed existential anxiety through cosmology. These distributions function differently but served same purpose. Purpose aligns with survival. Survival precedes meaning. Meaning emerges after survival is secured. This sequence governs human behavior across eras. People rarely pursue meaning at the expense of survival. They pursue meaning within survival constraints. This constraint shapes culture and art as much as politics. Culture adapts to limitation by ritualizing behavior. Ritual simplifies decision making. Simplification reduces cognitive load. This reduction conserves energy. Energy conservation supports endurance. Endurance appears mundane. It lacks spectacle. It consists of repetition and adjustment. This mundanity resists dramatization. This narrative embraces mundanity rather than resisting it. Embracing mundanity allows exploration of texture. Texture reveals how small choices accumulate into structure. Structure shapes behavior. Behavior reinforces structure. This feedback loop sustains systems. Catherine's policies reinforced hierarchical behavior. This behavior normalized authority. Frida's imagery reinforced introspective engagement. This engagement normalized vulnerability. The Red Queen's symbolism reinforced cosmic order. This order normalized acceptance. Acceptance differs from approval. It is acknowledgement of reality. Acceptance reduces struggle. Struggle consumes energy. Energy depletion threatens survival. Acceptance conserves energy. Acceptance does not imply passivity. It implies strategic restraint. Restraint prevents overextension. Overextension leads to collapse. History records many collapses born of overextension. Endurance avoids them through moderation. Moderation lacks glamour. It lacks heroism, but it persists. History favors persistence over heroism. Heroism flares and fades. Persistence shapes long-term outcomes. Catherine was not heroic in narrative sense. She was administrative. Her impact derived from sustained governance rather than dramatic acts. This sustained presence shaped institutions that outlived her. Frida's impact derived from sustained expression rather than innovation. She returned to same themes repeatedly. This return deepened rather than diminished resonance. The Red Queen's impact derived from sustained symbolic placement rather than political action. Her presence anchored belief across generations. Anchoring again surfaces. Anchors stabilize movement. They allow drift without loss. Anchored systems move slowly but do not lose orientation. Orientation matters. Orientation provides sense of direction even without destination. This sense reassures. It reduces anxiety. Anxiety management underpins endurance. Anxiety arises from uncertainty. Uncertainty arises from unpredictability. Predictability reduces uncertainty. This reduction calms societies and individuals alike. Predictability does not eliminate risk. It frames it within known parameters. This framing allows preparation. Preparation mitigates impact. This mitigation supports survival. Catherine prepared her empire through standardization. Standardization reduced variance. Variance introduces unpredictability. Frida prepared herself through routine. Routine reduced unpredictability of pain. Ritual. Societies prepared through calendrical cycles. Cycles reduced unpredictability of time. Time unpredictability unsettles humans. We seek structure to orient ourselves. Structure gives meaning to duration. Without structure, time feels amorphous. This amorphousness unsettles. This narrative provides structure through rhythm rather than segmentation. Rhythm organizes time gently. It does not demand attention. It guides experience subtly. This guidance aligns with sleep inducing narration. Sleep parallels endurance. Sleep restores capacity. Restoration supports continuation. Without rest, systems fail. This narrative offers rest through steady flow. Steady flow reduces spikes. Spikes awaken attention. Attention disrupts rest. This avoidance of spikes is deliberate. The deliberate calm mirrors how enduring systems operate. They avoid extremes. They dampen oscillation. They maintain equilibrium. Equilibrium is dynamic. It requires constant adjustment. This adjustment occurs quietly. Quiet adjustment lacks spectacle. It rarely enters record, but it defines lived experience. This narrative centers that experience rather than recorded highlights. Highlights distort perception. They suggest history moves through moments rather than processes. Processes matter more. Most change occurs through process. This narrative inhabits process. Process unfolds without clear beginning or end. It flows. This flow continues here. The continuation does not introduce new subjects abruptly. It deepens existing ones. This deepening reveals interconnection between governance, art, and ritual. These domains reflect similar strategies under different constraints. Human needs converge: survival, cohesion, and meaning. These needs persist across time and consistently shape responses. Consistency does not mean stagnation, it means adapting within limits. These limits define the human condition. As this account continues, it focuses on how people manage constraints through structure, routine, and repetition. It does not aim for resolution, it observes ongoing processes. History rarely resolves neatly. It accumulates and carries tensions forward quietly, shaping the future without announcement. Sudden rupture is rare. Long-lasting systems favor stability. Stability allows participants to remain oriented. There are no abrupt transitions, resets, or loops, only gradual forward movement. This movement may feel slow or almost stationary, but layers build over time. Change emerges quietly through accumulation. Change without drama, persistence without heroics, endurance without triumph. These qualities dominate real history. The point is to reflect lived experience, daily adjustment, routine, and steady continuation. Endurance extends beyond individuals. It flows through institutions, practices, and symbols. Memory preserves what continues to function. Catherine's memory endures because her structures lasted. Frida's memory endures because her work remained integrated into daily life. The Red Queen's memory endures because ritualized symbols carried meaning across generations. These forms of persistence do not demand attention but remain accessible. Accessible memory shapes identity. Identity informs behavior. Behavior reinforces structure. Structure continues. This cycle repeats naturally. Repetition here is not redundancy, it is reinforcement. Reinforcement stabilizes. Stability allows systems and people to operate under pressure. Forward movement continues steadily. It does not circle back or conclude. It observes how people maintain systems under constraint, trade intensity for longevity, accept repetition as necessary, and build durable structures by distributing pressure and smoothing over contradictions, still on the same topic, still moving gently forward, still unbroken, still unresolved. Steadiness is inherent to enduring systems. Catherine's administration assumed continuity as default. People acted as if tomorrow would resemble today, and often it did. This expectation supported stability. Systems designed this way feel heavy but reliable. Slow responses reduce errors and prevent conflict from escalating. Rapid action risks disruption. Catherine accepted slowness as a necessary cost of maintaining long term stability. She worked to seal cracks rather than create new openings. Sealing cracks may seem unremarkable, but it prevents collapse. Success is invisible, yet persistent structures shape space, movement, and limits. Quiet maintenance matters more than dramatic reform. Frida operated similarly. She did not seek constant shock. Familiarity in her work reinforced understanding. Repetition allowed symbols to resonate gradually. Initial confrontation faded as repeated engagement built recognition and acceptance. Engagement without confrontation conserves energy. Avoiding defensive interaction preserves resources. Frida communicated through image rather than argument. This indirect approach sustained her creative output. Ritual societies worked the same way. Symbols conveyed meaning without debate. Shared understanding reduced friction. Friction threatens cohesion. Cohesion preserves continuity. Cohesion binds individuals into larger systems. Systems endure longer than individuals. Individuals fade, but systems persist. Continuation may feel impersonal, but it maintains collective memory. Memory embedded in structure outlasts memory embedded in stories. Stories require retelling. Structures persist quietly. They embed behavior and guide action without explicit narration. This embedded guidance defines long term influence. Catherine's influence persisted through law and habit, Frida's through visual language, the Red Queen's through spatial symbolism. These influences did not need explanation, they were encountered and absorbed. Absorption differs from persuasion. Persuasion seeks agreement. Absorption shapes behavior subtly and subconsciously. People resist persuasion, but rarely resist absorption. Absorption occurs through exposure, which requires repetition. Repetition normalizes, normalization stabilizes, and stability extends lifespan. This cycle repeats across domains. It explains why familiar systems endure even when flawed. Flaws recede into background noise, which fades from attention as focus shifts elsewhere. Scarcity of attention shapes history. What receives attention changes. What fades persists. This selection is practical rather than moral. People respond to immediate pressure. Gradual decline rarely triggers notice. Gradual decline can persist for generations unnoticed. Expectations adjust slowly. People recalibrate normalcy. They perceive loss as baseline. This recalibration masks deterioration. Catherine's successors inherited the baseline she established. They did not experience earlier flexibility and accepted rigidity as normal. This acceptance prolonged system life while limiting adaptability. Frida's legacy followed a similar pattern. Viewers encountered her imagery as reference rather than innovation. Radical elements softened into standard, subtly influencing new work without announcement. The Red Queen's symbolism also became normalized. Cosmic order felt natural rather than constructed. Naturalization reinforced belief, and belief anchored behavior. Anchored behavior reduces volatility, which threatens endurance. Endurance requires moderating volatility. This moderation appears in ritual, routine, and habit. Structured time reduces anxiety. Unstructured time invites rumination, which intensifies distress. Routine channels energy and supports functioning. Catherine's court followed strict schedules, regulating interaction and limiting spontaneity. Frida imposed structure on her creative process, limiting output but ensuring sustainability. She pursued continuity over maximum productivity. Continuity preserved presence. Presence matters more than volume. Volume overwhelms. Presence invites return. Repeated engagement deepens relationships, and deeper relationships endure longer than fleeting impressions. The Red Queen's presence persisted through location. Her burial site created a focal point, orienting collective memory. Memory anchored in place endures because place persists. Place outlives narrative, granting stability. Symbolic geography shapes belief quietly. Quiet influence defines endurance. It does not announce itself. It operates steadily, tolerates contradiction, absorbs stress, and adapts slowly. This adaptability without rupture characterizes long lived systems. Transformation implies break. Break invites chaos. Chaos accelerates collapse. Endurance avoids breakage by bending rather than snapping. Bending distributes force. Concentrated force breaks. Bending requires flexibility within limits, and these limits are crucial. Catherine allowed limited flexibility within hierarchy, preventing fracture. Frida allowed emotional flexibility within formal repetition, sustaining expression. Ritual societies allowed symbolic flexibility within cosmological frameworks, preserving meaning. Balance requires constant adjustment. Adjustment consumes effort. Most historical effort leaves no visible trace, it maintains rather than creates. This maintenance work defines reality. Maintenance rarely inspires storytelling. Stories prefer beginnings and endings, but reality dwells in the middle. This narrative dwells in the middle, without rushing to conclusion. The middle stretches. It contains repetition and monotony. Yet monotony sustains life. Most days are similar. Similarity allows recovery from stress. Stress arises from change. Change demands adaptation. Adaptation consumes energy, which recovers through routine. This cycle governs endurance. Catherine's reign oscillated between pressure and routine. Frida's life oscillated between pain and work. The Red Queen society oscillated between ritual and labor. These oscillations maintained equilibrium. Equilibrium is dynamic. It shifts but remains bounded. These bounds prevent collapse and preserve the persistence of structure over time. Endurance here is not celebrated, it is observed. Observation allows appreciation without romanticization. Romanticization distorts by adding drama. Drama disrupts calm. Calm is maintained by acknowledging limitation without resistance. Resistance exhausts. Acceptance conserves. Acceptance here does not mean approval, it means recognition of reality. Recognition allows navigation. Navigation prevents collision. Collision causes damage. Damage threatens survival. Navigation supports continuity. Catherine navigated political realities. Frida navigated bodily limitations. Ritual societies navigated existential uncertainty. These navigations defined their endurance. Navigation rarely feels decisive. It feels cautious. It avoids extremes. It follows known paths. Known paths feel safe. They reduce anxiety. Anxiety undermines endurance. As this continuation proceeds, it remains within same navigational space. It does not veer abruptly. It follows established current. This following feels almost motionless, but movement continues. Layers accumulate quietly. Accumulation defines change. Change here is additive, not transformative. This additive change preserves identity. Identity stabilizes behavior. Behavior reinforces structure. Structure endures. Endurance remains the core observation. It ties together governance, art, and ritual. It explains why certain forms persist. It contextualizes their limitations. Limitations are not failures, they are boundaries. Boundaries enable focus. Focus concentrates effort. Concentrated effort produces durable outcomes. Durability matters more than brilliance. Brilliance flashes and fades. Durability shapes long term experience. This narrative honors durability. Honoring durability requires patience. Patience is built into pacing. This pacing avoids rush. It allows each thought to settle before next arrives. Settling reduces cognitive load. It encourages drifting attention. Attention drifts, but rhythm holds. Thread remains intact. Thread here is continuous. It does not loop. It does not reset. It extends gently forward. This extension mirrors historical time. Time does not restart, it flows. Flow continues regardless of observation. This narrative aligns with that flow. It does not impose structure beyond rhythm, it allows continuation. Continuation remains open ended. It resists closure. Closure would imply resolution. History rarely resolves. It persists with unresolved tensions. These tensions become background. Background shapes foreground quietly. This quiet shaping defines endurance. As the current moves on, it maintains the same measured pace, same thematic focus, same calm tone. It continues examining how humans persist within constraint, how they build systems that trade excitement for stability, how repetition becomes survival, how continuity emerges not from greatness but from habit and structure, still on the same topic, still moving forward, still unbroken, still without conclusion, continuing as history itself continues, quietly. The ending does not arrive like a door closing. It arrives the way evening settles, gradually, almost without notice, until movement slows, and everything simply rests where it already was. The long current of endurance does not stop, but our attention gently releases it because nothing more needs to be carried forward by voice. Catherine's structures remained standing not because they were perfect, but because they learned how to exist without demanding constant justification. They absorbed contradiction. They tolerated inefficiency. They survived on habit and expectation. These qualities are rarely admired, but they are deeply effective. They allowed life to continue in recognizable form, and for most people, that was enough. Frida's presence remains for similar reasons. Her work did not shout, it repeated, it returned, it stayed. This staying mattered more than novelty. It allowed viewers to meet the same symbols again, each time bringing different understanding. Her endurance was not loud, it was patient. It accepted limitation without surrendering expression. This quiet persistence turned personal experience into shared language without forcing interpretation. The Red Queen's memory rests even more quietly. She does not speak, she does not act. She simply remains where she was placed, anchored in space and symbol. Her endurance is not narrative, it is positional. It demonstrates how meaning can persist without explanation, how belief can be sustained through structure rather than story. This form of persistence feels almost invisible, but it is among the most durable. Together, these lives illustrate a truth that history rarely emphasizes because it lacks drama. that survival is mostly about staying functional, that continuity is built through repetition, that systems endure not by brilliance, but by learning how to tolerate imperfection without collapse. These truths are not inspiring in the heroic sense, but they are grounding. They reflect how humans actually live day after day within constraints that cannot be removed, only managed. Management replaces resolution. Resolution is rare in real life. Problems soften rather than disappear. They become familiar. They integrate into routine. This integration reduces their disruptive power. Catherine integrated political tension into administration. Frida integrated pain into creation. Ritual societies integrated uncertainty into cosmology. None of these integrations solved the underlying problem, but they allowed life to continue around it. Continuation is the quiet victory that history records without fanfare. It is the reason institutions outlast individuals. It is the reason symbols survive changing contexts. It is the reason routines persist even when their origins are forgotten. These continuities shape human experience more than decisive moments ever could. As attention slows, the patterns become clearer. Endurance favors moderation, it favors predictability, it favors structure over spontaneity, it trades excitement for stability, it accepts gradual loss to avoid sudden collapse. This trade is rarely celebrated, but it is repeatedly chosen because it works. What remains at the end is not a conclusion, but a settling, an understanding that most of history unfolds without climax, that power often looks like administration rather than command, that creativity often survives through discipline rather than freedom. That belief often persists through placement and repetition rather than argument. These realizations do not demand action, they invite acceptance. Acceptance here is not resignation, it is recognition of limits. Recognition allows calm. Calm allows rest. Rest restores capacity. Capacity supports continuation. This cycle mirrors the subject itself. The story ends by becoming what it describes, quietly easing into stillness rather than stopping abruptly. Nothing is resolved. Everything simply continues beyond the frame of narration. The systems remain, the symbols remain, the routines repeat. The human tendency to adapt rather than transform persists. This persistence is not glorious, but it is reliable. And reliability is the foundation upon which most of history quietly stands. With that, the voice no longer needs to carry the thread forward. The thread does not disappear. It remains woven into structures, habits, and memories that do not require retelling to exist. The current continues on its own, steady and unannounced, as it always has, and attention is free to rest, leaving history to do what it does best, carry on without needing to be watched.